January 21, 1842, saw the birth of a boy in the harsh industrial and agricultural landscape of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, who entered the world amidst the soot and struggle of the working class. Alfred, born to James and Esther Packer, grew up in a region defined by iron, coal, and the relentless demand for manual labor, where physical capability was the only currency of value. The air in Pennsylvania during the 1840s carried the heavy scent of wood smoke and unrefined coal, a constant reminder of the industry that drove the local economy. From a young age, the boy learned that survival required the ability to work long hours with one's hands, shaping wood or mending leather. His father, a cabinet maker by trade, moved the family west to LaGrange County, Indiana, seeking better prospects, but the harshness of frontier life remained a constant companion. The Packer household operated on strict principles of utility where every member had to contribute to the daily maintenance of their existence. Young Alfred apprenticed in carpentry and shoemaking, trades that required dexterity and focus, yet he struggled to maintain the rhythm expected of him. It was during these formative years that the first signs of his debilitating condition began to manifest, interrupting his labor and marking him as different from his peers. The condition was known then as the falling sickness, a mysterious and stigmatized ailment that seized the body without warning. In the mid-19th century, medical understanding of epilepsy was primitive, often attributing the convulsions to lunacy or moral failing rather than neurological dysfunction. For Alfred, the attacks were violent and humiliating. One moment he would be planing a board or stitching a sole, and the next his muscles would lock in a rigid spasm, his eyes rolling back as he collapsed into the dust. The seizures stripped him of control, leaving him thrashing on the floor while foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Observers viewed these episodes with a mixture of fear and disgust, often stepping away to avoid what they believed might be a contagious or demonic affliction. The physical toll was severe, leaving him bruised, exhausted, and mentally fogged for hours or even days after an event. These interruptions made steady employment difficult, as master craftsmen had little patience for an apprentice who might destroy materials or injure himself at any random moment. Consequently, Alfred drifted away from the skilled trades, finding himself pushed toward the margins of society where transient labor was the only option. By the time the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Alfred was living in Minnesota, working odd jobs and drifting between settlements. The war offered a distinct opportunity for men like him, regular pay, food, and clothing in exchange for service. The Union Army needed bodies to fill the ranks, and recruiters often looked past physical deficiencies to meet their quotas. On April 22, 1862, Alfred stood before a recruitment officer in Winona, Minnesota, and enlisted in the 16th United States Infantry. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, with blue eyes and light hair, looking the part of a capable soldier. He concealed his history of seizures, knowing that revealing the truth would result in immediate rejection. The promise of $13 a month and a signing bonus was enough to motivate his deception. He was assigned to the 1st Battalion, a unit preparing for the rigors of combat, but the reality of military life quickly exposed the frailty of his constitution. Training camp was a brutal shock to his system. The daily regimen involved hours of drilling, marching in formation, and manual labor to build fortifications. The diet consisted of hardtack, salted pork, and weak coffee, offering little nutrition to support the physical demands placed on the recruits. For a man prone to seizures, the stress, lack of sleep, and poor diet acted as potent triggers. It did not take long for the falling sickness to return with a vengeance. During a routine drill, Alfred collapsed in the mud, his body convulsing in the dirt before the eyes of his entire company. The drill sergeants, initially assuming he was drunk or malingering, soon realized the medical nature of the event as his jaw clenched shut and his limbs jerked uncontrollably. He was dragged to the medical tent where the regimental surgeon examined him with the blunt instruments and limited knowledge of the era. The medical facilities in the Union Army were grim places, smelling of chloroform, gangrene, and unwashed bodies. Surgeons overwhelmed by dysentery and typhoid cases had little time for chronic neurological conditions. Alfred was labeled as incapable of performing the duties of a soldier due to epilepsy. The diagnosis was not merely a medical observation, but a condemnation of his utility to the war effort. He spent weeks in the hospital listening to the groans of dying men and the sawing of bones while he waited for the bureaucracy to process his paperwork. The seizures continued, exacerbated by the noise of camp and the constant anxiety of his surroundings. His fellow soldiers grew wary of him, regarding him as a liability who could not be trusted with a musket or a watch shift. The camaraderie of the unit, usually a source of strength for soldiers, was denied to him. On December 29, 1862, just months after his enlistment, Alfred received a disability discharge at Fort Ontario, New York. The Army wanted nothing more to do with him. He was cast out into the winter cold, wearing a worn uniform and carrying a piece of paper that certified his unfitness. The discharge meant he was once again a civilian without prospects, but now he carried the additional burden of being a failed soldier. He drifted south and west, moving through the chaotic landscape of a nation at war. The roads were clogged with supply wagons, troops moving to the front, and refugees fleeing the violence. Alfred blended into this mass of humanity, surviving on scraps and occasional day labor. He avoided staying in one place for too long, fearing that his condition would reveal itself and lead to further ostracization. Despite his previous failure, the lure of the enlistment bounty remained strong. The war machine was insatiable, and by 1863 the standards for recruitment had lowered even further as casualties mounted. Alfred found himself in Ottumwa, Iowa, in June of 1863. He approached a recruiter for the 8th Iowa Cavalry, Company C, using the name Alfred to perhaps distance himself from his previous record or simply due to the phonetic spelling common among the semi-literate clerks of the time. Once again, he stood in line, answered the basic questions, and omitted the truth about his epilepsy. The recruiter, seeing a man who could walk and hold a pen, signed him up. This time, Alfred was joining a cavalry unit, a decision that would prove physically disastrous. Cavalry service required a level of balance, strength, and coordination that infantry service did not. A trooper had to care for his mount, ride for long hours over rough terrain, and fight from the saddle. For an epileptic, the horse itself was a danger. A seizure while mounted meant a fall from a considerable height, risking broken bones or being trampled. Alfred's assignment to the 8th Iowa took him into the heart of the conflict in the Western Theater. The regiment moved through Tennessee and Georgia, engaging in skirmishes and guarding supply lines. The physical toll of riding rubbed his skin raw, and the constant motion unsettled his neurological balance. He struggled to keep up with the column, his body aching from the saddle and his mind clouded by the fear of an impending attack, not from the Confederates but from his own brain. The soldiers of Company C were rough men, hardened by the violence of the frontier and the war. They had little sympathy for weakness. When Alfred began to display the telltale signs of his condition, staring spells, tremors, and sudden collapses, their patience evaporated. During a patrol in the oppressive heat of the Tennessee summer, Alfred fell from his horse in the middle of a march. The column halted, dust choking the air as the horses grew restless. His comrades watched as he writhed on the ground, his uniform covered in the red clay of the road. The lieutenant in charge ordered him placed in a supply wagon, treating him like broken equipment rather than a wounded man. He became a burden to the unit, a mouth to feed that offered no combat value. The regiment's surgeon, a man named Dr. W.H.H. examined Alfred after a series of particularly violent seizures. The doctor's notes were clinical and damning, describing a man completely unfit for the rigors of cavalry service. The Army's patience with Alfred Packer had run out. He was sent to the General Hospital, a purgatory where the sick and lame waited for their fate. The hospital was a sprawling collection of tents and commandeered buildings, filled with the stench of infection. Here, Alfred was just one of thousands of broken men. However, unlike those missing limbs or wasting away from fever, his condition was invisible until it struck, making him an object of suspicion among the staff who constantly watched for malingerers. It was during this second stint in the military that Alfred's personality began to harden. The constant rejection, the physical pain of the seizures, and the brutal environment of the army camps chipped away at his empathy. He learned that to survive, he had to look out for himself above all others. He observed the way the quartermasters hoarded supplies, how the strong preyed on the weak in the barracks, and how the truth was a flexible tool to be used for personal gain. He began to tell tall tales to the other patients, inventing stories of his exploits to gain status or simply to entertain. These fabrications were the seeds of the persona he would later cultivate in the West: a guide, a scout, a man of experience. In reality, he was a sick man in a hospital bed, eating government gruel and waiting for the next convulsion. The Medical Review Board finally processed his case in April of 1864. The recommendation was unanimous: discharge for disability. The paperwork cited his confirmed epilepsy and noted that the condition had existed prior to enlistment, technically disqualifying him from a pension, though the chaotic record-keeping of the time left loopholes. On April 22, 1864, Alfred was discharged from the 8th Iowa Cavalry at Cleveland, Tennessee. He was stripped of his carbine, his saber, and his horse. He walked away from the military for the second time, having served nearly a year without distinguishing himself in any positive manner. He was 21 years old, but his body and mind bore the wear of a much older man. The trek north from Tennessee was a journey through a devastated landscape. The South was in ruins, with burned-out farmhouses and fallow fields lining the roads. Alfred moved slowly, utilizing the railways when he could, stealing rides on freight cars or walking along the tracks. He headed west again, drawn to the frontier where a man's past mattered less than his current utility. The seizures continued to plague him, striking at inopportune moments. In a rail yard in Chicago, he suffered a fit that nearly caused him to roll onto the active tracks. A brakeman pulled him to safety, not out of kindness, but to avoid the paperwork of a fatality. Alfred recovered on the wooden platform, wiping the blood from his bitten tongue, and boarded the next train toward the Iowa-Nebraska border. By 1865, the war was drawing to a close, but the chaos of the frontier was just beginning. Thousands of demobilized soldiers, freedmen, and immigrants were flooding westward, looking for gold, land, and a fresh start. Alfred joined this migration not as a pioneer with a vision, but as a drifter looking for the next meal. He worked briefly as a wagon teamster, a job that suited his desire to keep moving. Driving a team of oxen or mules required a heavy hand and a loud voice, both of which he possessed. However, the work was physically exhausting. Loading and unloading freight, wrestling with stubborn animals, and sleeping on the hard ground took a toll on his health. During a supply run to a remote outpost in the Dakota Territory, the isolation of the wilderness began to seep into his psyche. The vast, empty plains were a stark contrast to the crowded army camps. Here, the silence was absolute, broken only by the wind and the howl of wolves. Alfred found a strange comfort in the desolation. In the wild, there were no officers to judge him, no peers to mock his seizures. If he fell into a fit on the trail, only the oxen witnessed his vulnerability. He began to view the wilderness not as a place of danger, but as a sanctuary where he could exist on his own terms. However, this isolation also fed his delusions. Without the social checks of a community, his stories became more elaborate. He started convincing himself of his own lies, believing he was a seasoned frontiersman capable of navigating any terrain. In the summer of 1865, Alfred found himself in the rough settlements along the Missouri River. These towns were hives of activity, filled with saloons, gambling halls, and supply stores outfitting expeditions to the gold fields of Montana and Colorado. Alcohol became a way for him to self-medicate. Whiskey dulled the sharp edges of his anxiety and he believed suppressed the frequency of his seizures. He spent his meager earnings on cheap liquor, often passing out in alleys or livery stables. The locals knew him as a peculiar figure, a man with an intense stare and a voice that could switch from whining to aggressive in a heartbeat. He picked up the nickname Al, and occasionally the epileptic, though rarely to his face. His diet during this period was erratic, consisting of whatever he could scavenge, steal, or buy with a few coins. He developed a taste for raw meat, a habit born of impatience and necessity on the trail, which some observers found unsettling. He would slice strips of bacon or beef and consume them uncooked, claiming it gave him strength. This behavior, combined with his unkempt appearance, greasy hair, stained clothes, and a distinct lack of hygiene, made him a repellent figure to polite society. Yet in the rough fraternity of the frontier, hygiene was a luxury, and eccentricity was tolerated as long as a man could pull his weight. Alfred's attempts to hold down a steady job continued to fail. He worked briefly at a copper mine, but the confined dark spaces triggered his claustrophobia and anxiety. He tried his hand as a hunter, supplying meat to the mining camps, but his aim was inconsistent due to the tremors in his hands. He was a jack of all trades, master of none, surviving on the fringes of the economic boom. The West was a land of opportunity for the strong and the lucky, but for Alfred, it was a landscape of harsh indifference. He watched others strike it rich or build successful businesses while he remained stagnant, a bitterness growing in his gut that would fuel his later actions. As July of 1865 approached, the heat on the plains became oppressive. Alfred was working a temporary job helping to construct a telegraph line. The work involved digging post holes and stringing wire, repetitive back-breaking labor under the relentless sun. The crew was a mix of Civil War veterans and immigrants, a volatile group prone to fighting. One afternoon, a dispute arose over rations. Alfred, feeling slighted by the cook, flew into a rage. He threatened the man with a shovel, his eyes wide and manic. It was not a seizure, but a glimpse of the violent temper that lay beneath his pathetic exterior. The foreman fired him on the spot, casting him out onto the prairie with nothing but his bedroll and a canteen. Alone on the high plains, Alfred walked for days to reach the nearest settlement. He suffered a seizure during the trek, waking up hours later with his face pressed into the abrasive soil, the sun blistering his neck. He was dehydrated, starving, and disoriented. This near-death experience in the wilderness did not scare him. Instead, it hardened his resolve. He had survived where others might have perished. He interpreted his survival not as luck, but as proof of his resilience. He began to see himself as a survivor, a man whom nature could not kill. This dangerous overconfidence would eventually lead him to make promises he could not keep to men who would pay the ultimate price. By the end of July 1865, Alfred Packer had fully transitioned from a discharged soldier to a frontier drifter. He had no home, no family, and no allegiance to any flag. He carried the physical scars of his epilepsy and the psychological scars of his rejection. He was a man hollowed out by circumstance, filling the void with delusions of grandeur. He looked toward the Rocky Mountains, the jagged peaks rising in the distance, and saw not a barrier, but a stage. He moved further west, leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind, walking toward a destiny written in snow and blood. The epileptic boy from Pennsylvania was gone. In his place was a creature of the frontier, desperate, damaged, and dangerous. 1866 arrived with a biting wind that swept across the Great Plains, pushing Alfred Packer further into the expanse of the American West. The vast territories beyond the Missouri River were undergoing a violent transformation, carved up by pickaxes and railway spikes. Packer moved with the current of desperate men seeking fortune, his silhouette just another dark shape against the horizon of the Wyoming and Colorado territories. He found himself in the rough-hewn mining camps that clung to the sides of mountains like barnacles, places where the only law was the weight of a man's fist or the speed of his revolver. In these isolated communities, a man's past was irrelevant, provided he could swing a hammer or shovel gravel. Packer, however, lacked the physical stamina for sustained hard labor. The tremors in his hands and the unpredictable nature of his seizures made him a liability in the deep shafts where a moment's inattention could bury a crew alive. Instead, he gravitated toward the periphery of the mining industry, taking jobs that required less precision and offered more autonomy. He worked as a hunter for a brief spell, stalking elk and deer through the scrub oak to feed the hungry crews, though his marksmanship remained mediocre at best. During the late 1860s, Packer drifted between the Colorado Territory and the newly formed Wyoming Territory, absorbing the geography not through skilled cartography but through the aimless wandering of a vagrant. He learned the names of rivers and peaks, not because he conquered them, but because he slept in their shadows, shivering under a thin blanket. It was during these lonely nights by small, smokeless fires that he began to construct the fabrication of his own expertise. He realized that in a land filled with greenhorns from the east, a man who spoke with confidence could command respect, even if his words were hollow. He began to introduce himself not as a drifter, but as a prospector and a guide, a man who knew the hidden trails and the secret veins of gold. The lie was a survival mechanism, a way to secure a meal or a drink from wide-eyed newcomers eager for advice. He spun tales of rich strikes in the San Juan Mountains, a rugged range in southern Colorado that was officially Ute territory and strictly off-limits to white settlers. The forbidden nature of the San Juans only added to the allure of his stories, and Packer found that men were willing to pay for the promise of prohibited wealth. By 1872, the mining fever had spread to the Utah Territory. The discovery of silver and lead in the Oquirrh Mountains drew thousands of men to Bingham Canyon, a chaotic fissure in the earth choked with mud, tents, and the smoke of smelters. Packer arrived in Bingham Canyon looking for an opportunity to exploit the desperation of others. He found work mucking out stables and hauling supplies, tasks that he considered beneath his newly fabricated dignity. He resented the successful mine owners and the skilled engineers who looked down on him. His envy curdled into a deep-seated malice. He watched the wagon trains arrive, loaded with supplies and hopeful men, and he saw them not as fellow pioneers, but as marks. He frequented the saloons that lined the muddy main street, nursing cheap beer and listening to the rumors of the next big strike. It was here, in the dim light of kerosene lamps, that the Arizona Party began to take shape, though it was born from a lie Packer told to anyone who would listen. The rumor mill in 1873 was ablaze with talk of the Breckenridge discoveries and the potential riches in the San Juan region of Colorado. The Treaty of 1868 had secured the land for the Ute people, but the pressure to open it for mining was immense. Packer seized on this excitement. He claimed to have personal knowledge of the area, asserting that he had prospected there years prior and knew the location of placer gold that could be scooped up by the handful. He boasted of knowing the safe routes through the treacherous passes and claimed he could navigate the terrain even in the dead of winter. This was a dangerous falsehood. Packer's actual experience in the high San Juans was non-existent. He had skirted the edges of the mountains but had never penetrated their frozen heart. Yet his voice carried the conviction of a man who believed his own deception. In the autumn of 1873, a group of 21 men gathered in the Provo and Bingham Canyon area, united by the desire to reach the Colorado gold fields before the spring rush flooded the region. They were a diverse lot, ranging from hardened frontiersmen to inexperienced laborers. Among them were key figures who would play pivotal roles in the tragedy to come. There was Preston Nutter, a shrewd and capable man who eyed Packer with a degree of skepticism, but was willing to take the risk. There was Oliver D. Lautzenheiser, a man of some means who helped finance the expedition. And there were the 5 men who would eventually follow Packer into oblivion. Israel Swan, a 65-year-old veteran prospector whose age showed in his weary gait. Shannon Bell, a tall, red-headed man with a fierce temper and a strong back. James Humphrey, George Noon, and Frank Miller, all working-class men looking for the one big score that would change their lives. Packer presented himself to this group as a wagon master and guide. He stood before them in the dusty streets of Provo, wearing a worn coat and a battered hat, his eyes alight with manic energy. He told them he could lead them to the headwaters of the Rio Grande, passing through the Uncompahgre Agency, and have them panning for gold before the snows grew too deep. It was November, a time when sensible men hunkered down for the winter. The passes in the Rockies were already accumulating snow, and the temperatures were dropping rapidly. To attempt a crossing of the high country in late autumn was an act of recklessness bordering on suicide. However, the men were blinded by gold fever. They pooled their resources, purchasing wagons, horses, and supplies. Packer contributed nothing but his alleged expertise, yet he managed to secure a position of authority within the group. He promised them a swift journey, claiming the route was clear and the weather would hold. The preparation for the journey was haphazard. The men bought flour, bacon, coffee, and ammunition, packing the wagons until the axles groaned. They acquired horses that were sturdy but not bred for the deep drifts of the high mountains. Packer walked among them, inspecting the gear with a critical eye, offering useless advice on how to pack a mule or secure a load. Some of the men, particularly Nutter, noticed that Packer seemed unfamiliar with the basic knots and hitches used by seasoned teamsters. When questioned, Packer would bristle and deflect, launching into a story about a previous expedition where he had saved a party from disaster. His defensive nature was a warning sign that went unheeded. The group was desperate for a leader, and Packer was the only volunteer. In mid-November 1873, the party departed from Provo, Utah, heading east toward the Colorado border. The initial leg of the journey took them through the high desert, a landscape of sagebrush and red rock that offered easy travel. The sun was still warm during the day, and the men's spirits were high. They camped near water sources, cooking their meals over open fires and sharing stories of what they would do with their riches. Packer ate voraciously, often taking more than his share of the rations. He rode a horse that had been provided for him, sitting awkwardly in the saddle, his posture revealing his lack of equestrian skill. As they moved further east, the terrain began to change. The flat horizon gave way to the rolling foothills of the Wasatch, and then the imposing wall of the Rockies. The first signs of trouble appeared when they reached the Green River. The crossing was difficult, the water cold and swift. Packer hesitated at the bank, unsure of the best ford. It was one of the other men, a quiet farmer named Bobbitt, who eventually found the safe path across. Packer quickly claimed credit for the decision, stating he had been testing the other's judgment. The men grumbled but pressed on. As they entered the Colorado territory, the weather turned. Gray clouds descended from the peaks, obscuring the sun and dropping the temperature well below freezing. The wind howled through the canyons, biting through their wool coats and chilling them to the bone. The horses struggled on the rocky trails, their breath pluming in the frigid air. By the time they reached the desolate stretch near the Colorado-Utah border, the group began to encounter the reality of winter travel. The wagons became a burden. The wheels sank into the softening mud during the day and froze into the ruts at night. Progress slowed to a crawl. They were covering only a few miles a day, far short of the pace Packer had promised. The supplies, which had seemed ample in Provo, began to dwindle. The men were burning more calories fighting the cold and the terrain than they were replenishing. Arguments broke out over the rationing of food. Packer, sensing his authority slipping, became more aggressive. He berated the men for their weakness, calling them soft and unsuited for the frontier. He claimed the rich gold fields were just a few days' march away, a moving target that never seemed to get any closer. The Arizona Party, as they came to be known, though they had no connection to Arizona other than a vague intention to perhaps head south if the San Juans failed, was fracturing. The 21 men split into smaller cliques bound by friendship or shared suspicion of their guide. Preston Nutter began to openly challenge Packer's decisions. He pointed out that they were heading into a box canyon or taking a route that added miles to their journey. Packer would shout him down, his face flushing red, his eyes bulging. "I know this land," he would scream, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I have walked every inch of it." The seizures, which he had managed to hide during the easy days of the trek, began to surface under the stress. One evening, while tending the fire, Packer froze, his arm twitching rhythmically. He dropped a pot of coffee into the flames, scalding his hand. He claimed it was just a slip, a moment of clumsiness, but the men exchanged worried glances. They were miles from civilization, led by a man who seemed unstable in both mind and body. As December 1873 arrived, the snow began to fall in earnest. It started as a dusting, a white powder that coated the sagebrush, but soon it deepened into a heavy blanket that concealed the trail. The wagons became useless, the wheels were clogged with ice and mud, and the horses were exhausted from pulling the heavy loads through the drifts. The party was forced to make a critical decision. They abandoned the wagons, transferring their supplies to the backs of the horses and their own shoulders. This was a significant blow to their morale. They were no longer a well-equipped expedition. They were a group of refugees trudging through the snow. The physical toll was immense. Their boots, made of simple leather, soaked through, freezing their toes. Their hands cracked and bled from the cold and the rough handling of ropes and gear. Packer's navigation became increasingly erratic. He would lead them up a ridge only to find a sheer cliff on the other side, forcing them to backtrack for hours. He mistook landmarks, confusing one peak for another. He claimed they were near the Dolores River when they were actually miles away on a tributary. The men's trust in him evaporated. They began to rely on their own instincts, checking the position of the sun and the flow of the water. Packer, realizing he was losing control, resorted to fear. He told them stories of the Ute warriors who patrolled these mountains, savages who would kill a white man on sight. He claimed he was the only one who knew the secret signs to ensure their safe passage. This was another lie, but it played on the deep-seated racial anxieties of the men. The group reached a point of near starvation as they stumbled toward the Uncompahgre Valley. Their flour was gone and they were subsisting on horse feed, cracked corn intended for the animals. They boiled the corn into a grim mush that provided little sustenance. They began to butcher the weaker horses, eating the stringy, tough meat to survive. Packer gorged himself on the horse meat, displaying a gluttony that disgusted the others. He would crack the bones to suck out the marrow, grease smearing his beard. His survival instinct was primal, overriding any sense of decorum or sharing. He hoarded the best cuts for himself, stealing from the communal pile when he thought no one was looking. When caught, he would feign ignorance or claim he was testing the meat for spoilage. The landscape they traversed was a monochrome nightmare of white snow and gray rock. The trees were skeletal, their branches weighed down by ice. The wind was a constant physical assault, stinging their eyes and freezing the moisture in their nostrils. In this frozen hell, the social veneer of the 19th century began to strip away. The men stopped shaving, stopped washing, stopped caring about anything other than the next step and the next meal. They were becoming feral, reducing their existence to the basic biological imperative of survival. Packer, with his history of drifting and scraping by, adapted to this degradation faster than the others. He seemed to thrive in the misery, his eyes darting around, always calculating the odds. By late January, the party was in a desperate state. They were lost, freezing and malnourished. They had crossed into the Ute reservation lands, a violation of federal treaty, but the law meant nothing here. They were intruders in a hostile environment that wanted them dead. It was in this condition that they finally spotted the smoke of a distant encampment. Hope surged through the group. They believed they had found a settlement, a trading post, or perhaps a mining camp. As they drew closer, dragging their weary bodies through the knee-deep snow, they realized it was not a white settlement. It was the winter camp of Chief Ouray of the Ute tribe, located near the confluence of the Uncompahgre and Gunnison rivers. The sight of the teepees rising from the snow was both a relief and a terror. They were at the mercy of the very people Packer had demonized. However, they had no choice. They limped into the camp, a pathetic procession of starving skeletons. The Ute warriors watched them with stoic expressions, their hands resting on their rifles. Packer pushed his way to the front, trying to affect an air of authority, but he looked as wretched as the rest. He called out in broken English and pantomime, begging for food. Chief Ouray, a man of immense dignity and intelligence, emerged from his lodge. He surveyed the group of white men, his eyes taking in their condition. He saw the frostbite on their faces, the hollows of their cheeks, and the madness in their eyes. He did not order them killed. Instead, in an act of profound humanity that stood in stark contrast to Packer's lies, he ordered his people to feed them. The arrival at Chief Ouray's camp marked the end of the first phase of their disaster. They had survived the trek from Utah, but only barely. The wagon master had led them not to gold, but to the brink of death. Packer's reputation was in tatters among the men, yet he still clung to his role as their guide. He sat by the Ute fires, eating their venison and corn, his mind already plotting the next move. He knew the gold was still out there, buried under the snow of the San Juans. The comfort of the Indian camp was temporary. The mountains loomed overhead, silent and waiting. The 21 men were alive, but the unity of the group was shattered. They were now a collection of individuals, each eyeing the other with suspicion. And at the center of it all sat Alfred Packer, the man who had promised them wealth and delivered them into the jaws of winter. November 1873 to January 21st, 1874. The 21st of January, 1874, broke with a brilliance that blinded the eyes, the sun reflecting off the endless expanse of snow that choked the Uncompahgre Valley. Inside the lodge of Chief Ouray, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, cured hides, and the unwashed bodies of the desperate men who had stumbled out of the white wasteland. The Arizona party had arrived not as conquerors but as beggars, their grand ambitions of gold reduced to a singular gnawing need for sustenance. The Ute encampment, situated near the present-day site of Montrose, Colorado, was a sprawling collection of teepees that offered the only sanctuary for 100 miles in any direction. Here, the social hierarchy of the white prospectors was inverted. They were guests on land they had intended to exploit, dependent entirely on the charity of a people they deemed savages. The irony was lost on most of them, consumed as they were by the primal ecstasy of a full belly. Chief Ure sat on a buffalo robe, his presence commanding a silence that the miners found unsettling. He was a man of 50 years with a face etched by the harsh winds of the Rockies and eyes that held a sharp, penetrating intelligence. He wore the traditional garb of his people, but his mannerisms betrayed a deep understanding of the encroaching white civilization. He spoke English, Spanish, and several dialects of the Ute language, serving as a bridge between two worlds that were destined to collide. To the starving men, he was initially just a provider of meat, but as their strength returned, he became an obstacle. Ure knew the San Juan Mountains better than any mapmaker in Washington. He knew the moods of the sky and the treachery of the deep snows. When he looked at Alfred Packer and his ragtag band, he did not see pioneers. He saw corpses waiting to happen. The diet in the camp was a stark departure from the grim rations of horse feed and boiled leather the men had survived on for weeks. The Utes provided them with dried venison, strips of elk meat, and a dense bread made from ground roots and corn. The sudden influx of protein and fat caused their shrunken stomachs to cramp violently, a painful reminder of their prolonged starvation. Packer ate with a fervor that bordered on mania. He shoveled the food into his mouth with trembling hands, his eyes darting around the lodge as if expecting someone to snatch the bowl away. Even as his hunger was sated, the gluttony remained, a psychological scar from the weeks of deprivation. He hoarded scraps in his pockets, the grease staining his already filthy trousers, unable to trust that the next meal would arrive. As the days turned into weeks, the initial gratitude of the party began to curdle into impatience. The gold fever, temporarily suppressed by the fear of death, flared up again as soon as their energy returned. They gathered in small clusters outside the teepees, smoking tobacco traded from the Utes and whispering about the riches that lay buried under the snow just south of them. Packer was the loudest voice in these circles. He sat cross-legged on the frozen ground, drawing maps in the dirt with a stick, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He claimed that the Utes were exaggerating the danger to keep the white men away from the gold. He insisted that the Breckenridge mines were accessible, that the passes were clear enough for men on foot, and that he alone possessed the knowledge to navigate them. Ure, observing these gatherings, called a council with the leaders of the White Party. He invited Packer, Preston Nutter, and Oliver Lautzenheiser into his lodge, offering them pipe tobacco as a gesture of diplomacy. The atmosphere was tense. The firelight danced on the walls of the teepee, casting long, distorted shadows. Ure spoke slowly, choosing his words with precision. He told them that the mountains to the south were a death trap in winter. He explained that the snow in the high passes was deeper than a tall pine tree and that no game moved in those elevations during the cold months. He warned them that if they entered the San Juans now, they would find neither shelter nor food, only the white sleep that claims the foolish. He urged them to stay in the valley until spring, or if they must leave, to take the longer, safer route north along the Gunnison River to the Los Pinos Indian Agency, staying in the lower elevations where the snow was manageable. Packer listened to the chief with a mask of polite deference, but behind his eyes a fire of arrogance burned. He interrupted Ure, claiming that he had traveled these mountains before and knew shortcuts that the Indians were unaware of. It was a staggering display of hubris. A drifter with a history of failure was lecturing a tribal leader who had spent his entire life mastering this terrain. Ure looked at Packer with a mixture of pity and contempt. He saw the falling sickness in Packer's tremors, the weakness in his posture, and the deception in his speech. He told Packer plainly that he did not know the mountains, that his shortcuts were myths. and that if he led men into the high country, he would be leading them to their graves. The warning was explicit, detailed, and chilling. It was not a vague caution. It was a prophecy. The confrontation with Ouray shattered the fragile unity of the Arizona party. Preston Nutter, a man who valued logic over bravado, took the chief's words to heart. He saw the truth in the Indians' eyes and the madness in Packer's. Nutter began to organize a faction that would heed the warning, deciding to either wait out the winter or take the safer Gunnison route as suggested. Lutzenheiser wavered, caught between the caution of Nutter and the seductive promises of Packer. The camp became a hotbed of political maneuvering. Packer, feeling his influence slipping, doubled down on his lies. He targeted the most vulnerable members of the group, those who were most desperate for money or least experienced in the wild. He sought out Shannon Bell, the red-headed giant whose temper was as volatile as the weather. Bell was frustrated by the delay. He wanted action, he wanted gold, and he was willing to bully his way through the snow to get it. Packer fed Bell's impatience, telling him that Nutter was a coward who wanted to steal their claim. Israel Swan was another target. At 65, Swan knew this was likely his last chance at a fortune. His body was worn, his joints aching from the cold, but his mind was fixed on the idea of a comfortable retirement. Packer played on this anxiety, whispering that if they waited until spring, the younger, faster men would claim all the best ground. Swan, terrified of being left behind, clung to Packer's promises like a drowning man to a raft. Then there was Frank Miller, the heavy-set butcher who wielded a knife with practiced skill but lacked the imagination to foresee the horrors of starvation. Miller was a follower, a man who needed a leader to tell him where to step. Packer provided that direction, however flawed. George Noon, a mere teenager in experience, if not years, looked up to Packer and Bell with wide-eyed admiration. He was eager to prove his manhood, to show that he could handle the real frontier. James Humphrey, quiet and stoic, simply wanted to get the job done. He listened to Packer's confident assertions and mistook them for competence. By the end of January, the camp was divided into two distinct camps. The tension was palpable. The Utes watched with stoic amusement as the white men argued over routes and rations. Ouray, seeing that some of the men were determined to leave regardless of his advice, decided to offer them a final lifeline. He provided them with supplies for the journey, but he rationed them strictly based on the route he advised. He gave them enough flour and meat to reach the Los Pinos agency via the Gunnison River route. A journey of perhaps 7 days if the weather held. He did not give them enough for a month-long trek through the high San Juans because he did not believe anyone would be foolish enough to attempt it. Packer, however, saw the supplies as a means to his own end. He gathered his chosen 5, Bell, Swan, Miller, Noon, and Humphrey, and convinced them that with these rations they could make a dash across the mountains to the headwaters of the Rio Grande. He argued that the government cattle station near the Los Pinos agency was closer than Ouray claimed, and that they could reach it in a few days. He lied about the distance, lied about the terrain, and lied about the food. He told them he had a secret stash of supplies or that he knew where caches were hidden by previous trappers. It was a fabrication born of desperation. Packer wanted to leave, and he needed carriers for his gear and a buffer against the wild. The exchange of goods in the camp was a desperate commerce. The men traded their revolvers, their coats, and even their pocket knives for extra food from the Ute families. Packer traded a Colt revolver for a supply of dried meat, a transaction that would leave him underarmed but momentarily well-fed. The Utes were shrewd traders. They knew the value of steel and lead, and they knew that the white men could not eat bullets. The stripping of their weaponry was a symbolic castration of the party. They were venturing into the wilderness not as armed conquerors but as vulnerable prey. The only weapons they retained were a few skinning knives, a hatchet, and a couple of rifles, tools that would soon be turned to gruesome purpose. The environment around the camp in late January was a deceptively peaceful tableau. The valley floor was covered in a manageable layer of snow, packed down by the movement of the tribe and their horses. The sun shone brightly during the short days, creating an illusion of warmth. But every evening, as the sun dipped below the rim of the canyon, the temperature plummeted with violent speed. The air grew so cold that the trees would crack with the sound of pistol shots. It was a reminder that the warmth was fleeting, and the cold was the permanent state of the world. Ure pointed to the clouds gathering over the southern peaks, dark bruises against the blue sky. "The storm is sleeping," he told them. "Do not wake it." Packer's behavior during these final days was increasingly erratic. He would oscillate between manic optimism and sullen withdrawal. One moment he was slapping backs and predicting millions in gold. The next, he was sitting alone, staring blankly into the fire, his body racking with the tremors of a suppressed seizure. The other men, perhaps too invested in the dream or too afraid to acknowledge the reality, ignored these signs. They rationalized his behavior as the eccentricities of a seasoned guide. They needed him to be the expert, so they willed themselves to believe he was. This collective delusion was the glue that held the Packer party together. On the eve of the split, a final argument erupted between Nutter and Packer. Nutter accused Packer of leading the men to their deaths. He pointed out Packer's lack of proper gear, his poor physical condition, and his ignorance of the landmarks. Packer exploded in rage, his face turning a mottled purple. He screamed that Nutter was jealous, that he wanted the gold for himself. "I will be digging nuggets while you are still shivering in this camp," Packer yelled, spitting on the ground near Nutter's boots. The confrontation nearly came to blows, stopped only by the intervention of the other men and the silent, imposing presence of the Ute warriors who stepped closer to the fire. The line was drawn. There was no going back. The night before their intended departure was a restless one. The 5 men who had pledged their lives to Packer lay in their blankets, listening to the wind howl outside the lodge. Doubts surely crept into their minds. Swan, rubbing his aching knees, must have wondered if his old body could withstand the climb. Bell, cleaning his rifle, perhaps calculated the odds of survival. But the momentum of their decision was a heavy weight. To back out now would be to admit fear, to admit defeat. They were men of the West, defined by their grit. Turning back was not in their vocabulary. Packer slept fitfully, his dreams likely haunted by the specter of the falling sickness and the vast white emptiness that awaited him. The morning of the separation was gray and cold. The sky was a sheet of steel, promising snow. The main group, led by Nutter and Lautzenheiser, prepared to take the river route or stay put. They looked at the Packer party with a mixture of relief and sorrow, like men watching a funeral procession. Packer, Bell, Swan, Miller, Noon, and Humphrey gathered their meager belongings. They had their blankets, their small sacks of corn and dried meat, a coffee pot and a hatchet. They wore heavy wool coats, patched and stained, and leather boots that had already been soaked and dried a dozen times. They looked less like an expedition and more like a group of refugees fleeing a war zone. Ure emerged from his lodge to witness their departure. He did not offer a blessing. He stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He pointed one last time to the Gunnison River, the safe path. Packer ignored the gesture. He turned his back on the chief, the man who had saved their lives, and pointed his face toward the high peaks of the San Juans. "We go south," he declared, his voice thin in the cold air. It was a statement of defiance against nature itself. The 5 men shouldered their packs and fell in line behind him. They walked out of the camp, trudging through the snow, leaving the safety of the fire and the wisdom of the Ute behind. As they moved away from the encampment, the silence of the wilderness swallowed them. The sounds of the barking dogs and the laughing children faded, replaced by the crunch of their boots on the crust of the snow. The terrain immediately began to rise, the gentle slope of the valley giving way to the rugged foothills. The snow grew deeper with every mile. Packer took the lead, but his pace was uneven. He stumbled often, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The confidence he had displayed in the camp began to evaporate as the physical reality of the ascent set in. The shortcut he had promised was nowhere to be found. Instead, they faced a wall of scrub oak and pine, tangled and dense, forcing them to hack their way through. The first few hours of the trek were a grim precursor to the nightmare that would follow. The sky darkened and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Large, wet clusters that clung to their eyelashes and melted down their necks. The wind picked up, driving the cold through the layers of wool. The men did not speak. The energy they had expended in the arguments at the camp was now needed for the simple act of lifting their legs. They were walking into a trap, and the jaws were beginning to close. Behind them, the smoke from Uray's fires was a distant gray smudge against the white sky, the last beacon of civilization they would see for months. Packer stopped at the crest of a ridge, looking back not at the camp, but at the trail they had made. It was a jagged, clumsy line in the snow, a testament to their lack of coordination. He wiped his nose with a gloved hand, his eyes scanning the horizon for landmarks he did not know. He saw a peak in the distance and claimed it was a marker for the Rio Grande. It was a lie. It was just another anonymous mountain in a range of thousands. He turned to the men, forcing a grin that looked more like a grimace. "Not far now, boys," he said. The wind snatched the words from his mouth and scattered them into the void. The 5 men looked at him, their faces pale and set. They didn't believe him, but they followed him. There was nowhere else to go. The sun began to set on that fateful day, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The temperature dropped precipitously. They made a rough camp in a cluster of pines huddled together for warmth. They ate a meager ration of the cornmeal bread Uray had given them, washing it down with melted snow. The conversation was sparse. The reality of their situation was settling in. They were 6 men alone in the winter wilderness, with limited food, inadequate clothing, and a guide who was making it up as he went along. The warning at the Uncompahgre had been clear, loud, and ignored. Now the silence of the San Juans was the only voice that mattered, and it spoke of nothing but cold and death. As the fire burned down to embers, Packer stared into the coals. The tremors in his hands were back, a subtle vibration that traveled up his arms. He clamped his hands between his knees to steady them. He knew, deep in the recesses of his damaged mind, that he had made a mistake. But the path back was blocked by pride and the deep snow. The path forward was blocked by the mountains. They were trapped in the funnel of fate. The first night of their independent journey marked the crossing of a threshold. They had stepped out of the world of men and into the world of survival, where the rules of morality would soon be frozen and shattered like brittle ice. February 9th, 1874, marked the beginning of the true ascent into the San Juan Mountains, a date that would serve as the boundary between civilization and the void. The 6 men moved away from the Uncompahgre Valley, following the frozen ribbon of the lake fork of the Gunnison River. The initial miles offered a deceptive ease, the snow packed hard by the wind and the terrain rising at a gradual incline. Alfred Packer walked at the front, his eyes fixed on the southern horizon while the others trailed in a ragged line, their breath pluming in the frigid air like steam from a locomotive. The silence of the wilderness was absolute, broken only by the crunch of leather boots on the ice crust and the rhythmic shifting of the heavy packs on their shoulders. The towering peaks of the San Juans, jagged and white, loomed ahead like the teeth of a massive trap waiting to snap shut. As they pushed deeper into the high country, the geography began to fight them. The valley walls steepened, narrowing the path and forcing them to navigate through dense stands of pine and fir. The snow, which had been manageable near the Ute encampment, deepened with every 100 feet of elevation gained. It transformed from a hard surface into a soft, treacherous powder that swallowed their legs up to the knees with every step. The men, lacking snowshoes, were forced to post-hole, a grueling physical motion that required lifting the leg high above the snow level and driving it down, only to have it sink again. This movement burned through their caloric reserves at a terrifying rate. Israel Swan, the eldest at 65, began to lag behind almost immediately. His lungs wheezed in the thin air, a wet rattling sound that grated on the nerves of the younger men. By the third day, the weather turned against them with a malice that felt personal. The blue sky vanished behind a curtain of leaden clouds that descended from the peaks, obscuring the sun and flattening the light. A wind began to howl down the canyon, driving needles of ice into their exposed skin. The temperature plummeted, freezing the moisture in their nostrils and coating their beards in rime. The storm did not arrive as a sudden squall, but as a relentless, crushing weight. The snow fell in heavy, wet sheets, erasing the landmarks Packer claimed to know. The world was reduced to a monochrome gray, disorienting the senses and destroying any perception of distance or direction. Packer stopped frequently, squinting into the whiteout, his confidence visibly eroding. He would point vaguely to a ridge or a cluster of rocks, muttering assurances that rang hollow in the howling wind. The provisions they had carried from Uray's camp began to dwindle rapidly. The dried venison and cornmeal intended to last a week of careful rationing were consumed with desperate speed as the cold stripped the heat from their bodies. The human body in such extreme conditions acts as a furnace, demanding fuel to keep the core temperature stable. Without adequate intake, the internal fire begins to consume the reserves of fat and muscle. The hunger was a physical pain, a cramping in the gut that never ceased. Frank Miller, a man of substantial bulk, suffered intensely as his large frame demanded more energy than the meager rations could provide. He became surly and aggressive, snapping at George Noon for walking too close or for stumbling. The camaraderie of the campfire was replaced by a grim, silent hostility. Navigation became a game of chance. Packer led them up a steep tributary, believing it to be a shortcut to the headwaters of the Rio Grande. The terrain was brutal, a chaotic jumble of fallen timber hidden beneath the snow. They climbed over slick logs and scrambled up scree slopes where the snow had been scoured away by the wind, only to find themselves on a precipice with nowhere to go but down. They were forced to backtrack, losing precious elevation and energy. Each mistake chipped away at their morale. Preston Nutter's warnings echoed in their minds, a ghostly reminder of the folly they had committed. Shannon Bell, whose temper was a constant low-burning fuse, began to eye Packer with open contempt. He questioned every turn, demanding to know where the game trails were, where the shelter was, where the gold was. Packer had no answers, only defensive snarls and more lies about landmarks just over the next rise. The nights were an ordeal of endurance. They lacked tents, sleeping only in their blankets on boughs of pine cut with their hatchets. They dug pits in the snow to escape the wind, huddling together like livestock in a storm. The fire was their only defense against the encroaching frost. Lighting it with damp wood and numbed fingers was a nightly struggle that took hours. Once the flames caught, they would sit as close as they dared, their fronts roasting while their backs froze. The smoke stung their eyes, red-rimmed from snow blindness, but they did not move away. Sleep was fitful and dangerous. To fall into a deep sleep was to risk not waking up, the cold creeping into the blood and stopping the heart. They took turns watching the fire, feeding it stick by stick, guarding the flame as if it were a living thing. By the end of February, the food was gone. The last crumbs of the cornmeal bread had been licked from the sacks. The men scoured the landscape for anything edible. They stripped the bark from pine trees to chew on the soft cambium layer underneath, a bitter, resinous substance that stuck to their teeth and offered no nourishment. They found rose hips clinging to frozen bushes, small red berries that were mostly seed and skin, providing a burst of vitamin C but no calories. They boiled the rose hips in snow water, drinking the pale pink tea in a futile attempt to trick their stomachs. The hunger changed from a sharp pain to a dull, lethargic ache. Their movements slowed. Their speech became slurred. They were entering the early stages of starvation, where the body begins to shut down non-essential functions to preserve the brain and heart. The physical deterioration of the party was rapid and horrific. Their faces became gaunt, the skin stretching tight over the cheekbones. Their eyes sank into their sockets, acquiring a glazed, thousand-yard stare. Frostbite began to claim their extremities. Toes turned waxy and white, then darkened to a bruised purple. The pain of the thawing nerves when they held their feet near the fire was excruciating, a burning agony that made grown men weep. Israel Swan was in the worst shape. His age left him with no reserves. He stumbled constantly, falling into the drifts and requiring help to stand. The others began to view him not as a companion, but as an anchor dragging them down. The sounds of his weakness, the coughing, the groaning, the slow shuffling, became a focal point for their collective misery. Packer's epilepsy, triggered by stress and malnutrition, remained a lurking threat. While he did not suffer a grand mal seizure during the trek, he experienced absent seizures, moments where he would simply stop, staring blankly at the snow, unresponsive to shouts or shoves. These episodes terrified the others, who interpreted them as madness or a sign that their guide was losing his mind. When he snapped back to reality, he would be confused and irritable, unable to recall the last few minutes. He compensated for his vulnerability with bluster, shouting at the men to keep moving, to stop whining. He wielded the hatchet they used for firewood with a possessiveness that was unsettling, keeping it close to his hand at all times. The group became lost in a labyrinth of peaks. They were trapped in the high basin of the San Juans, surrounded by mountains that rose to 14,000 feet. The snow was 10 feet deep in places, burying the landscape in a suffocating white blanket. They were walking on top of trees, the tips of the pines barely poking through the drifts. The sky was a relentless gray ceiling that pressed down on them. There was no game. The elk and deer had long since migrated to the lower valleys, just as Ure had predicted. The only living things in that high hell were the 6 starving men and the ravens that began to trail them, black shapes circling against the clouds, waiting. Hallucinations became common. James Humphrey, usually the most grounded of the group, began to see shapes in the trees, buildings, wagons, people. He would point excitedly at a rock formation, claiming it was a chimney, only to have the illusion dissolve as they approached. The mind, starved of glucose, began to misfire. They heard voices in the wind, the sound of church bells or the barking of dogs. These auditory phantoms gave them moments of false hope that were cruelly crushed by the silence. Paranoid delusions also took root. Each man suspected the others of hoarding food. They watched each other urinate, watching for signs of hidden sustenance. If a man lingered too long behind a tree, he was accused of eating a secret stash. The social contract that binds men together in civilization evaporated completely. Civility was a luxury they could no longer afford. They stopped using names, addressing each other with grunts or insults. The hierarchy of the group shifted from the one who had the money or the map to the one who had the physical strength to take the next step. Shannon Bell emerged as the dominant physical force, his anger fueling his endurance. He bullied the others, pushing them to keep moving when they wanted to lie down and die. He looked at Packer with murderous intent, his hand often hovering near the knife at his belt. Packer, sensing the shift, kept his distance from Bell, positioning himself near the weaker members like Swan or Noon, using them as a buffer. In early March, they reached a plateau where the wind had scoured the snow down to the rock. They collapsed there, too exhausted to build a fire. They huddled in a pile, sharing body heat. Packer sat slightly apart, his eyes scanning the group. He saw the way they looked at the leather of their boots, the way their jaws worked as they chewed on strips of leather cut from their own gear. They were eyeing the impossible. The taboo of human flesh was still intact, but the barrier was thinning with every hour of hunger. The idea hung in the air, unspoken but palpable, a dark current running beneath their misery. They were no longer men on an expedition, they were organisms in a desperate struggle for existence. The geography they traversed was relentless. They crossed the divide near Slumgullion Pass, a name that would later become synonymous with their doom. The pass was a high, exposed saddle where the wind reached hurricane force. It knocked them off their feet, rolling them across the ice. They lost gear. A blanket blown away into the canyon, a tin cup dropped and buried instantly in the drift. These losses were catastrophic. Without the cup, they could not melt snow efficiently. Without the blanket, one man would freeze faster. They fought over the remaining items, wrestling in the snow like starving wolves. The violence was clumsy and weak, fueled by desperation rather than malice. George Noon, the youngest, began to weep openly. He cried for his mother, for his home, for a warm bed. His tears froze on his cheeks. The sound of his sobbing enraged Frank Miller, who kicked at the boy, telling him to shut his mouth. The brutality was a defense mechanism, a way to distance themselves from the vulnerability that they all felt. If they acknowledged Noon's pain, they had to acknowledge their own. They hardened their hearts, turning their empathy into a callous shell. They marched on, leaving a trail of blood in the snow where their cracked boots leaked. Packer's deception was finally laid bare when they crested a ridge and saw only more mountains. There was no Rio Grande, no government cattle station, no smoke from a chimney. There was only the endless, indifferent white. The men stopped and looked at him. There was no anger left, only a profound, hollow despair. They realized then that they were walking towards their deaths. Packer did not apologize. He stared back at them, his eyes flat and dead. He knew he was lost, but he refused to say the words. He simply turned and began to walk downhill, following the path of least resistance, leading them deeper into the trap. The starvation-induced a state of ketosis, where the body's breakdown of fat produced a sickly sweet smell on their breath. It was the scent of death, hanging around them like a shroud. Their gums bled, their teeth loosened. The skin on their hands cracked open, the fissures refusing to heal. They were rotting while still alive. The physical agony of the first week had given way to a dreamlike trance. They moved automatically, putting one foot in front of the other because to stop was to die. The will to live was the only thing propelling them, a stubborn biological imperative that defied logic. As the sun set on another day in the white hell, the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The trees popped and cracked in the cold. The 6 men found a depression in the snow at the base of a large fir tree. They crawled into it, pressing their bodies together. Israel Swan was shivering violently, his body convulsing in the throes of severe hypothermia. The others ignored him, focusing on their own shivering. They were 6 islands of misery, connected only by the proximity of their bodies. The fire they managed to start was small and smoky, offering little heat. They stared into the flames, their minds empty of everything but the image of food. Steaks, bread, potatoes. The visions danced in the firelight, taunting them. Packer watched Swan. He watched the way the old man's head lolled on his chest. He watched the way the life was fading from his eyes. He felt the hunger clawing at his own stomach, a beast that demanded to be fed. He looked at the knife at his belt. He looked at the hatchet. The line between man and meat was blurring. The survival instinct, stripped of all social conditioning, was calculating the caloric value of the man beside him. It was a monstrous thought, born of a monstrous situation. The wind howled outside their small circle of light, screaming the truth that they were all trying to deny. Only the strong would eat, and only the eaters would survive. The descent into the white hell was complete. They had been stripped of their supplies, their strength, their hope, and their humanity. They were raw, exposed nerves in a world of ice. The mountains had broken them. Now the mountains would watch as they turned on each other. The night deepened, and the snow continued to fall, burying the 6 men in a silence that was heavy with the promise of violence. The next sunrise would not bring rescue. It would bring the end of the Arizona Party and the birth of the legend of the Colorado Cannibal. March 1874 arrived in the San Juan Mountains not with the promise of spring, but with a renewed intensity of winter that sealed the fate of the 6 men trapped in the high basin. The camp they had established near the banks of the Lake Fork of the Gunnison River was a wretched collection of trampled snow and charred wood, located in a dense grove of fir trees that blocked out the pale light of the sun. The wind screamed through the upper branches, a constant deafening roar that isolated the group from the rest of the world. Inside the small depression they had dug into the snow, the air was stagnant, smelling of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and the metallic tang of impending death. The social structure that had barely held them together during the ascent had completely disintegrated. There was no leader, no guide, and no shared purpose. There were only 6 starving organisms, each retreating into a shell of biological desperation. Israel Swan, the 65-year-old prospector who had struggled so mightily on the trail, was the first to succumb to the inevitable. For days he had sat motionless by the smoky fire, his head resting on his knees, muttering incomprehensible prayers that eventually faded into silence. His body, depleted of all fat and muscle reserves, was pushed beyond the brink, but what ended his life was violence. On a bitterly cold morning in early March, the other 5 men woke to find Swan stiff and cold, his skull split by a hatchet blow, his eyes frozen open, staring at the gray sky. There was no mourning. The capacity for grief had been starved out of them. Instead, the surviving men looked at the corpse with a complex mixture of envy and predatory calculation. Frank Miller, the butcher by trade, stared at the body not as a friend, but as a carcass. The hunger that gnawed at their intestines was a physical agony, a sharp, twisting pain that overrode every moral instruction they had ever received. The conversation that followed was brief and pragmatic. Shannon Bell, his voice a rasping croak, stated the reality that they all knew. If they did not eat, they would die. Alfred Packer, sitting across the fire, nodded slowly. He did not look away from the body. The decision was not made with a vote or a ceremony. It was made by the silent drawing of a knife. Miller, his hands trembling not from emotion but from weakness, took the initiative. He approached Swan's body with his skinning knife. The sound of the blade cutting through the frozen layers of clothing was loud in the stillness. The others watched, their eyes wide and unblinking. When the first incision was made into the flesh, the taboo that separates man from beast was severed. They cooked the meat on the end of sticks over the fire, the smell of roasting flesh triggering a ferocious, animalistic response in their saliva glands. They ate voraciously, burning their mouths in their haste, the grease coating their cracked lips and matted beards. The consumption of Israel Swan bought the survivors a reprieve of several days. The protein and fat revitalized their strength temporarily, but it also altered the psychological landscape of the camp. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. They looked at each other now with a new understanding. Every man was potential food. The camaraderie, already frayed, turned into a tense standoff. They slept with one eye open, clutching their knives beneath their blankets. The fire, once a source of communal warmth, became a spotlight where they watched for sudden movements. Packer, who had been the guide, now assumed a more sinister role. He ate more than his share, using his position near the fire to snatch the best portions. His energy returned faster than the others, and with it came a cunning alertness. As the meat from Swan ran out, the hunger returned with a vengeance compounded by the psychological horror of what they had done. Frank Miller, despite the recent meal, was still in a perilous state. His large frame required massive amounts of calories, and the temporary sustenance had only jump-started his metabolism, making the subsequent crash more severe. He became delirious, shouting at invisible demons and thrashing in the snow. His noise was a liability. It attracted the attention of the others, who were sitting in a grim circle, their stomachs once again empty. It was mid-March when the violence escalated from scavenging to murder. Miller was cleaning his fingernails with a small knife, muttering to himself when the decision was silently reached among the stronger members. The details of Miller's death were brutal and efficient. He was struck in the head with the camp hatchet. The blow was heavy and decisive, crushing the skull and ending his delirium instantly. The forensic evidence that would later be uncovered told the story of a man killed while likely unsuspecting or incapacitated. Packer later claimed he was out gathering wood, but the geometry of the camp suggested a collective action or a singular execution witnessed by the group. With Miller dead, the butchery began again. This time, the hesitation was gone. The men worked with the grim efficiency of a slaughterhouse crew. They stripped the body of its useful clothing, adding the layers to their own freezing frames. Miller's red flannel shirt ended up in Packer's possession, a vibrant splash of color in the monochrome camp. The camp at Slumgullion Pass had transformed into a charnel house. The snow around the fire pit was stained dark with blood and scattered with discarded bones. The four remaining survivors, Packer, Shannon Bell, George Noon, and James Humphrey, were trapped in a cycle of consumption. George Noon and James Humphrey were the next to falter. They were younger, less hardened than Bell or Packer. The horror of their situation broke their minds before their bodies gave out. They huddled together, refusing to make eye contact with the men who were eating their companions. But starvation does not allow for conscientious objection. Eventually, they too partook, driven by the biological imperative to exist. However, their utility to the group was diminishing. They were weak, they did not gather wood, and they did not contribute to the maintenance of the fire. In the twisted logic of the survival camp, utility was the only currency. Humphrey died next. Whether by the hatchet or by the elements, his end was accelerated by the group's need. The hatchet, a heavy tool with a hammer pole on the back, became the instrument of selection. Humphrey was struck down, his body added to the larder. George Noon, the youngest, was now alone with Packer and Bell. The dynamic was terrifying. Noon was essentially a walking supply of meat to the two older, stronger men. He knew it. He sat by the fire, weeping silently, watching Bell sharpen his knife. Noon's death followed soon after Humphrey's. The forensic testimony would later show that the blows to the skulls of these men were remarkably similar. Clean, forceful strikes that indicated a killer who knew exactly how to swing the weapon. By late March, only Alfred Packer and Shannon Bell remained alive. The camp was a silent graveyard of stripped bones and scattered possessions. The snow had deepened, burying the evidence of the earlier atrocities. But the immediate vicinity of the fire was a horror show. Packer and Bell eyed each other across the flames. They were the two strongest, the two most willing to do whatever was necessary. Bell was a tall, powerful man with a temper that had been exacerbated by the diet of human flesh and the isolation. Packer was smaller but scrappier, possessed of a rat-like cunning. They existed in a state of armed truce for several days. They slept in shifts, neither willing to close their eyes while the other was awake. The final confrontation occurred in the first week of April. The exact sequence of events is known only through the filter of Packer's later. Shifting confessions and the silent testimony of the bones. Packer claimed Bell went mad and attacked him. However, the physical evidence found at the site painted a different picture. Bell was shot in the abdomen and then finished off with a crushing blow to the head. It was a violent, chaotic struggle in the snow. Packer, perhaps feigning sleep or waiting for Bell to turn his back, utilized the rifle that had been useless for hunting game but was deadly at point-blank range. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, the first loud noise in weeks. Bell collapsed, clutching his stomach, the blood bright red against the white snow. Packer did not hesitate. He seized the hatchet, the tool that had ended the lives of the others, and brought it down on Bell's skull, ensuring there would be no counterattack. With Bell dead, Alfred Packer was the sole survivor of the Arizona party. He stood alone in the silence of the San Juans. The wind howled around him, but he was alive. He did not flee the scene of the massacre immediately. In fact, he did the opposite. He settled in. The death of Bell provided him with a fresh supply of food, and he no longer had to share it. He spent the next several days living in the camp, surrounded by the decomposing remains of his 5 companions. He built up the fire, making himself comfortable. He took the best clothing from the dead men, layering 3 pairs of trousers and 2 coats to ward off the chill. He rummaged through their pockets, collecting their wallets, their cash, and a skinning knife that belonged to Frank Miller. This period of isolation transformed Packer. He was no longer the epileptic drifter who had failed in the army. He was a master of his own dark domain. He butchered Bell's body with practiced skill, slicing the meat from the thighs and the chest. He cooked the flesh over the fire, eating until he was full. The starvation that had plagued him for months was reversed. His cheeks filled out, his energy returned, and the color came back to his face. He sat by the fire, mending his torn clothes with a needle and thread he found in one of the packs. He was a man utterly divorced from the laws of civilization. He existed in a primitive state where the only mandate was to feed and stay warm. The sheer pragmatism of his actions was chilling. He did not run from the horror, he consumed it. The environment around him began to change as April progressed. The sun grew stronger, melting the surface of the snow during the day. The water in the creek began to flow more freely, breaking through the ice. The birds returned, their songs sounding strange in the place of death. Packer used the time to curate his gear. He selected the best wool blanket, the sturdiest pack, and the most reliable rifle. He filled a coffee pot with live coals to carry fire with him, a trick of the mountain men. He packed a supply of human meat, wrapping it in pieces of blanket to sustain him on the hike out. He was preparing for his re-entry into the world, calculating his route and his story. On April 16, 1874, Alfred Packer decided it was time to leave. He extinguished the fire that had burned for weeks. He looked around the camp one last time. The bodies were scattered in the snow, some reduced to skeletons, others partially butchered. He left them where they lay, unburied and exposed. He did not offer a prayer. He shouldered his pack, which was heavy with the belongings of the dead men and the flesh he had harvested from them. He picked up a walking stick and turned his back on the carnage. He began the descent following the lake fork of the Gunnison River north, moving toward the lower elevations where the snow was receding. The journey out of the mountains was physically demanding, but nowhere near as brutal as the ascent had been. Packer was well fed and rested. He moved with a steady, purposeful gait. The snow was still deep in the shadowed canyons, but on the exposed ridges the ground was bare. He navigated the terrain with a newfound confidence. He was a survivor, a man who had looked death in the face and eaten it. As he dropped in elevation, the air grew warmer. He saw deer moving in the brush, but he did not shoot at them. He had food in his pack. He camped alone at night, building small fires and cooking his rations. He slept soundly, untroubled by the ghosts of the men he had left behind. After several days of hiking, he spotted the familiar signs of cattle grazing in the distance. He had reached the chaotic fringes of civilization. He adjusted his pack and checked his appearance. He knew he looked wild. His hair was long and matted, his beard stained with grease, and his clothes a patchwork of other men's garments. But he also looked healthy. He did not have the skeletal appearance of a man who had been starving for months. This discrepancy was a detail he failed to consider, a visual fact that would soon raise suspicion. He walked toward the Los Pinos Indian Agency, his silhouette moving against the greening hills. He encountered the first human beings he had seen since killing Bell near a cow camp. They were rough men, working the herd, but to Packer, they looked like salvation. He did not run to them screaming of the tragedy. He approached them casually, asking for the location of the agency. He threw away the remaining human meat in his pack before he reached them, discarding the evidence of his survival into the brush. He kept the wallets and the money, tucking them deep into his layers of clothing. He composed his face into a mask of weariness, preparing to tell the first version of the lie that would define the rest of his life. As he walked the final miles to the agency, the butcher of Slumgullion faded, and Alfred Packer, the victim of circumstance, emerged. He practiced his limp. He hunched his shoulders to appear smaller. He prepared to beg for food he did not need. He arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency not as a monster, but as a curiosity. The men at the agency saw a lone survivor emerging from the white hell of the San Juans. They did not yet know that the man standing before them, asking for a cup of whiskey, was a walking graveyard, his body sustained by the lives of 5 men. The mountains behind him held the truth, frozen in the red snow, waiting for the spring thaw to reveal the atrocity. April 16, 1874, brought a strange figure walking out of the wilderness and into the perimeter of the Los Pinos Indian Agency. The facility, a collection of log structures situated roughly 20 miles west of Saguache in the Colorado Territory, served as the administrative center for the Ute tribe and a way station for the few travelers crossing the Cochetopa Hills. The man who approached the main building did not stumble or crawl. He walked with a steady, peculiar gait, his boots thudding rhythmically against the thawing mud of the road. Alfred Packer presented a visual contradiction to the men who ceased their labor to watch him pass. His hair hung in long, greasy strands that matted against his neck, and his beard was a tangled thicket of neglected growth. Yet his face lacked the hollow, skull-like sunkenness of a man who had faced the true deprivation of the high San Juans. His cheeks held a ruddy color, and the skin around his eyes appeared puffy, almost swollen, a physical trait inconsistent with weeks of starvation. He entered the mess hall of the agency, the sudden warmth of the indoors causing him to pause. The room smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and damp wood, aromas that would normally drive a starving man into a frenzy. Packer, however, approached the cook, a man named Herman Lauter, with a demeanor that was demanding rather than desperate. He requested food, but his eyes did not fixate on the pot simmering on the stove with the maniacal intensity Lauter had seen in other lost travelers. Packer sat at a rough wooden table, placing his rifle, a Winchester that did not belong to him, against the bench. When the plate of meat and potatoes was placed before him, he ate, but not with the animalistic speed expected of a survivor. He consumed the meal with a steady, almost bored efficiency, stopping frequently to request whiskey. The alcohol seemed to be his priority. He downed several shots of the harsh liquor, the liquid courage loosening his tongue and relaxing his guarded posture. General Charles Adams, the Ute Indian agent and a man of distinct military bearing, was soon alerted to the arrival of the straggler. Adams was a sharp, observant administrator who understood the realities of the Colorado winter. He entered the mess hall and observed Packer from a distance before approaching. He noted the man's clothing, a chaotic layering of wool and flannel that seemed ill-fitted, as if he were wearing the wardrobes of 3 different men. Adams sat opposite Packer and began the inquiry with professional detachment. He asked where the man had come from and who he was. Packer, wiping grease from his beard with the back of his hand, introduced himself and launched into the first of many fabrications. He claimed he was part of a larger party that had left Utah, but that his feet had become frozen and sore, forcing him to lag behind. Packer told Adams that the other 5 men, Swan, Bell, Miller, Humphrey, and Noon, had abandoned him in the deep snow, taking the bulk of the provisions and leaving him with a rifle and a small amount of ammunition. He stated that the others were likely ahead of him, perhaps already in Silverton or Saguache. He claimed to have survived on roots, rosebuds, and the occasional rabbit he managed to snare. Adams listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning Packer's face. The story was plausible on the surface. Men abandoned the weak in the frontier often enough. However, the physical evidence sat across the table, contradicting the words. A diet of roots and rosebuds for 2 months would leave a man emaciated, weak, and likely suffering from scurvy. Packer was none of those things. He possessed a layer of bodily fat that suggested a high caloric diet, and his energy levels were high enough that he immediately asked for directions to the nearest saloon. After the initial interview, Packer did not rest or seek medical attention for his allegedly frozen feet. Instead, he made his way to the agency's trade store and later to the small settlement of Saguache. His behavior in the following days was reckless and arrogant, born of the belief that he had successfully outwitted civilization. He entered the saloons of Saguache with a swagger, his pockets heavy with the spoils of the dead. He approached the bar and ordered rounds of drinks for the house, slapping down distinct banknotes and gold coins. The currency was varied, including drafts from Utah banks and specific denominations that seemed out of place for a destitute guide. In a region where cash was scarce and credit was common, a drifter flashing hundreds of dollars attracted immediate attention. It was in Saguache that the threads of his deception began to unravel, pulled by the very men he had betrayed. Several members of the original Arizona party, the ones who had heeded Chief Urey's warning and taken the safer Gunnison route, were staying in the town, waiting for the spring thaw to continue their prospecting. Among them was Preston Nutter, the man who had openly challenged Packer's competence back in the Ute camp. Nutter was in the Dolan and Company store when he heard the commotion about the survivor from the mountains. He went to investigate, expecting to find a skeleton. Instead, he found Packer, drunk and loud, boasting of his survival. Nutter's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man. He recognized the coat Packer was wearing. It belonged to one of the missing men. The reunion was tense. Nutter and another original member, O.D. Lautzenheiser, cornered Packer. They asked him pointed questions about the fate of the others. Packer repeated his story about being abandoned due to sore feet. Nutter looked down at Packer's boots. They were worn, but Packer walked without a limp. He did not move like a man who had suffered severe frostbite. Nutter then noticed the accessories. In Packer's possession was a pipe that Nutter knew belonged to another man. Hanging from Packer's belt was a skinning knife of a specific make that Frank Miller had carried. The evidence of theft was visible, but the implication was far darker. If Packer had been left behind, how did he acquire the personal effects of the men who went ahead? Packer sensed the rising suspicion and attempted to deflect it with generosity. He offered to lend money to Nutter, pulling out a wallet that Nutter recognized as belonging to Israel Swan. The sight of the wallet was a shock. Swan was a man who guarded his money carefully. He would never have given his wallet to a guide he barely trusted, certainly not if he was abandoning him. Nutter refused the money, his mind racing. He went to General Adams, who had also traveled to Saguache to monitor the situation. Nutter voiced his concerns clearly. Packer was lying. He had the missing men's property, and he was spending more money than any of them had possessed individually. General Adams, already suspicious, decided to increase the pressure. He summoned Packer for a second, more formal interrogation at the agency headquarters. This time, the atmosphere was not one of a debriefing, but of an inquisition. Adams sat behind a desk, flanked by Nutter and other witnesses. He ordered Packer to empty his pockets. The result was damning. Packer produced multiple wallets, a large roll of bills, and a collection of personal items, including a pocket mirror and a specific type of pocket knife. Adams counted the money. It totaled over $100, a significant fortune for a laborer. Adams looked at Packer and asked him directly why he was carrying the wallets of the men he claimed had abandoned him. Packer's composure cracked. The alcohol had worn off, leaving him jittery and cornered. He tried to adjust his story, stammering that the men had given him their money for safekeeping before they split up. The lie was absurd. Men walking into a mining district would not hand over their cash to the man they were leaving behind. Adams did not buy it. He pointed out the physical impossibility of Packer's health. He told Packer that he looked like a man who had been eating 3 square meals a day, not a man surviving on frozen berries. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, until Adams finally voiced it. He asked if the men were dead. Packer looked at the floor, his hands trembling. The falling sickness lurked at the edges of his consciousness, triggered by the stress. He began to weep, a sudden, jagged release of emotion that was equal parts self-pity and fear. He confessed that the men were dead. However, he spun a new narrative, one that minimized his guilt. He claimed that the party had become lost and starved, just as he had said, but that the old man, Israel Swan, had died of natural causes, hunger and exhaustion. Packer claimed that the remaining men, driven mad by starvation, had eaten Swan to survive. He admitted to partaking in the flesh, framing it as a horrific necessity. He continued his revised story, detailing a cascade of death. He claimed that after Swan, Humphrey had died, then Miller, then Noon. He described their deaths as natural or accidental, the result of the harsh elements. He painted a picture of a group dwindling one by one, with the survivors feeding on the dead. He saved the most crucial lie for the end. He claimed that he and Shannon Bell were the last 2 left alive. According to Packer, Bell had gone insane, raving and threatening him. Packer stated that Bell had tried to kill him with a rifle stock, forcing Packer to shoot Bell in self-defense. He claimed he then ate a portion of Bell before packing up and hiking out. General Adams listened to this confession with a mixture of revulsion and skepticism. The story accounted for the cannibalism, which explained Packer's well-fed appearance, and it accounted for the money, as Packer claimed he took it to return to the families, but the details didn't sit right. Why did he have so many layers of clothing? Why did he have the specific knife of Frank Miller if Miller died of natural causes weeks before Bell? And why, if it was a case of tragic survival, had Packer lied so aggressively upon arrival? Adams ordered Packer to be held in custody. He was not yet charged with murder, as there were no bodies to prove the crime. But he was no longer a free man. The atmosphere at the agency shifted from curiosity to hostility. The Ute natives, who had a deep spiritual aversion to the consumption of human flesh, looked at Packer with undisguised horror. They referred to him as a man-eater. a creature that had violated the fundamental laws of nature. The white settlers and agency employees were equally disgusted. The idea of cannibalism was the ultimate frontier taboo, a descent into savagery that terrified them. Packer was isolated, kept under guard in a small room. He paced the floor, muttering to himself, his earlier arrogance replaced by the trapped energy of a cornered rat. Preston Nutter and the other original party members were not satisfied with the confession. They believed Packer had murdered the men for their money. They pointed out that Packer was a poor shot and a coward. The idea of him winning a fair fight against the giant Shannon Bell seemed unlikely unless Bell was asleep or incapacitated. They demanded a search party be organized to find the remains. They wanted to see the bodies, to see if the wounds matched Packer's story of natural death and self-defense. Adams agreed. He knew that the only way to uncover the truth was to find the camp in the San Juans. During his confinement in late April, Packer's mental state began to deteriorate. He suffered a seizure in his cell, thrashing on the dirt floor until the guards restrained him. When he recovered, he was dazed and confused, asking for water and claiming he was back in the mountains. The seizure reminded everyone of his instability, adding another layer of unpredictability to the prisoner. Adams questioned him again after the episode, probing for inconsistencies. Packer stuck to the Bell went crazy narrative, but he added strange details, mumbling about the wind and the cold, trying to evoke sympathy for the suffering he had endured. The news of the Colorado Cannibal began to spread. Riders carried the story to nearby mining camps and towns. It was a sensation, a grim tale that confirmed the worst fears of every prospector. Packer became a local celebrity of the darkest kind. People came to the agency just to catch a glimpse of the man who had eaten his companions. They peered through the windows or stood by the fence when he was allowed outside for air. Packer basked in the attention in a twisted way, sometimes stopping to stare back at the spectators with a cold, dead look that sent shivers down their spines. In early May, the preparations for the search party began. Adams demanded that Packer guide them back to the site. Packer resisted initially, claiming he could not retrace his steps, that the snow had changed the landscape, that he was too weak to make the journey. It was a transparent attempt to keep the bodies hidden. He knew what the snow preserved. He knew that the hatchet wounds on the skulls would tell a different story than his self-defense plea. But Adams was relentless. He told Packer that if he wanted to prove his innocence, he had to produce the evidence. He offered Packer a choice. Lead them to the camp or face a mob that was growing increasingly impatient and violent. Packer eventually capitulated. He agreed to lead a team consisting of General Adams, Preston Nutter, Herman Lauder, and a few others back into the mountains. The dynamic had shifted completely. Packer was no longer the guide leading men to gold. He was the prisoner leading men to a crime scene. He was outfitted with a horse, but he was not given a weapon. His hands were not bound, but the eyes of 5 armed men were fixed on his back at all times. As the departure date approached, Packer's anxiety manifested physically. He could not keep food down, vomiting the regular meals he was given. The agency doctor examined him and found nothing physically wrong other than the effects of extreme stress. The well-fed man was beginning to waste away from fear. He spent his nights pacing, checking the door, checking the window. He knew that the melting snow in the San Juans was revealing the truth. The winter that had concealed his crimes was ending, and the spring would bring a reckoning. On the morning of the departure, Packer stood in the agency yard. The sun was shining, the grass was turning green, and the birds were singing. It was a beautiful spring day in the Rockies, a stark contrast to the darkness that awaited them in the high country. General Adams mounted his horse and looked down at Packer. "Show us the place," Adams commanded. Packer mounted his horse clumsily, his face pale and sweating. He looked toward the mountains, the white peaks still visible in the distance. He nodded once, a jerky motion of his head. The group rode out of the Los Pinos agency, leaving the safety of the valley behind. They headed south, retracing the path of the dead, guided by the man who had consumed them. The man who had walked out of the wilderness alone was now being dragged back into it, to stand before the silent jury of the bones he had left behind. May 1874 began with a cavalcade of deception as Alfred Packer led a search party out of the Los Pinos agency, ostensibly to locate the remains of his 5 companions. The group, which included General Charles Adams, the suspicious Preston Nutter, and several other agency employees, rode south toward the San Juan Mountains under a sky that alternated between spring sunshine and threatening gray clouds. Packer, mounted on a horse he did not own, rode at the front, but his behavior was anything but that of a confident guide. From the moment they crossed the threshold of the agency, he began a performance of calculated incompetence. He claimed that the melting snow had altered the landscape so drastically that he could not recognize the landmarks he had passed just weeks prior. He led the men up blind canyons, stopped at random intervals to stare blankly at ridges, and frequently doubled back, claiming he had missed a turn. The men behind him grew increasingly agitated, their patience wearing thin with every aimless mile. Preston Nutter, whose skepticism had hardened into certainty, watched Packer with the eyes of a hawk. He noted that Packer seemed to be deliberately avoiding the lake fork of the Gunnison, the very drainage where common sense dictated the party must have traveled. When questioned, Packer would feign a dizzy spell or launch into a rambling story about the blinding snowstorms that had confused his sense of direction. He played the part of the traumatized survivor, hoping that pity would override their suspicion. However, the men of the frontier were practical. They knew that a man who had walked out of a region successfully should be able to retrace his steps, especially when the weather was fair. The expedition became a farce, a game of cat and mouse played out across the rugged terrain of the Cochetopa Hills. The landscape they traversed was waking up from the long winter, the mud thick and clinging to the horses' hooves, slowing their progress and adding to the frustration of the party. Packer sweated profusely despite the cool mountain air, his anxiety manifesting in a constant nervous chatter that grated on the nerves of General Adams. He would point to a distant peak and claim it looked familiar, only to recant minutes later, stating that the snow had played tricks on his eyes. This stalling tactic was a desperate attempt to run out the clock, to force the party to turn back before they stumbled upon the truth. After days of fruitless wandering, during which the supplies began to dwindle and the mood turned poisonous, the search party reached a breaking point. General Adams, realizing that Packer was stalling to prevent the discovery of the bodies, called a halt to the charade. He confronted Packer, accusing him of leading them on a wild goose chase. Packer broke down again, claiming that his memory was fragmented by the trauma of his ordeal. It was a convenient excuse that allowed him to avoid the literal scene of the crime while maintaining the facade of cooperation. The party turned back toward Saguache, empty-handed but more convinced than ever of Packer's guilt. They returned him to the makeshift detention facilities in Saguache, where he was held not in a steel cage, but in a shack under the loose guard of the local sheriff. The failure of the search party left a vacuum of evidence, a silence that Packer hoped would protect him indefinitely. However, the San Juan Mountains could not keep such a gruesome secret forever. The cycle of the seasons worked against Packer. As May turned to June and June to July, the high country underwent a dramatic transformation. The deep snows that had buried the atrocities of the winter melted away, feeding the swelling rivers that roared down the canyons. The wildflowers bloomed in the alpine meadows, painting the slopes in vibrant purples and yellows, masking the grim reality that lay beneath the foliage. The heat of the summer sun warmed the earth, accelerating the biological processes of decomposition. The scene at Slumgullion Pass, once frozen in a tableau of ice, began to rot. The scent of death, suppressed by the cold, began to rise, carried on the wind to the scavengers of the forest. The birds and the insects, the first witnesses to the crime, descended upon the clearing, disturbing the stillness that Packer had left behind. In August 1874, the truth was finally uncovered, not by a lawman or a search party, but by an artist. John A. Randolph, an illustrator who contributed sketches to national publications like Harper's Weekly, was trekking through the region on an assignment to document the scenic beauty of the San Juans for the Eastern audiences hungry for views of the Wild West. Randolph was a man of observation, trained to notice details that others might miss. He was hiking near the Lake Fork of the Gunnison, roughly 2 miles southeast of Lake City. The day was warm, the air filled with the buzzing of insects and the rustling of aspen leaves. Randolph was looking for a vantage point to sketch the majestic peaks when a peculiar smell assaulted his senses. It was a sickly, sweet odor, heavy and cloying, unmistakably the scent of decaying organic matter. Randolph, assuming it was a dead elk or a cow that had strayed from a herd, continued his ascent, handkerchief pressed to his nose. The smell grew stronger, a physical weight in the air that made him gag. He pushed through a dense thicket of willows and emerged into a small clearing, a sheltered hollow protected by a stand of fir trees. The scene that greeted him was so horrific that it defied immediate comprehension. It was not a majestic landscape for his sketchbook. It was a slaughterhouse floor located in the heart of paradise. Scattered across the grassy depression were the decomposing remains of 5 human beings. The bodies lay in a rough semicircle around the remnants of a large campfire, the charred logs still visible in the center. The isolation of the spot had protected the site from large scavengers like bears, leaving the evidence remarkably intact, though ravaged by time and insects. Randolph stood frozen, his artist's eye taking in the grim composition. He saw the tatters of rotting wool clothing, the gleam of white bone where the flesh had fallen away, and the chaotic dispersal of camp equipment. He realized instantly that he had found the missing Arizona party. He approached the site with trepidation, the buzzing of bluebottle flies filling his ears like the roar of a distant waterfall. The insects were not merely present, they were a plague. The ground beneath the bodies was shifting with the movement of larvae, a detail that Randolph noted with scientific detachment but internal revulsion. The contrast between the vibrant life of the summer forest, the blooming columbines, the chattering squirrels, and the grim reality of the death circle created a dissonance that was deeply disturbing. The first body he examined was that of Israel Swan. The old prospector lay on his back, his body reduced to a skeletal frame held together by dried ligaments and leathery skin. The cause of death was immediately and brutally apparent. The top of Swan's skull was missing, crushed inward by a massive blow that had shattered the bone like porcelain. Beside the body lay a camp hatchet, its iron head rusted but its handle still showing the dark stains of dried blood. The proximity of the weapon to the victim suggested he had been struck down where he sat or slept. Moving clockwise around the circle of death, Randolph found the remains of Frank Miller. Miller's body presented a particularly gruesome spectacle. His head was entirely detached from his torso, found several feet away from the trunk. The skull showed signs of repeated trauma, as if the killer had struck him multiple times in a frenzy. The chest cavity of Miller's corpse had been torn open. Randolph, stepping closer, saw that the ribs were broken outward, and the flesh from the pectoral muscles and thighs had been stripped away with a knife. The long, precise cuts on the bones were distinct from the jagged tear marks of a wolf or mountain lion. This was the work of a blade, wielded by a human hand. Next were the bodies of George Noon and James Humphrey. They lay close together as if they had died seeking comfort in proximity. Their skulls bore the same signature, blunt force trauma consistent with the pole of a hatchet. The back of the hatchet, the hammer side, had been used to deliver the killing blows. The violence inflicted upon them was efficient and catastrophic. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate vicinity of their bodies, suggesting they had been killed quickly, perhaps while they were weak from starvation or sleeping. Their clothing had been rifled through, pockets turned inside out, confirming the theft Packer had already been accused of. The fifth body, that of Shannon Bell, lay slightly apart from the others near the edge of the clearing. Bell's remains told a more complex story of the final moments of the camp. His legs were wrapped in a blanket, suggesting he might have been shot while lying down, or that his killer had wrapped him post-mortem. Near his body lay a rifle, the stock broken in two. The breakage indicated that the rifle had been used as a club, swung with tremendous force. Bell's skull was smashed, but his torso also showed damage consistent with a gunshot wound, though the advanced state of decomposition made it difficult for Randolph to be certain without a coroner. What was clear was that Bell had been butchered like the others. Large sections of flesh were missing from his upper legs and back. Randolph sat on a rock at the edge of the clearing, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the atrocity. He opened his sketchbook, his hands trembling. He felt a duty to document the scene exactly as he found it, to preserve the truth, before the elements could erode it further. He sketched the position of the bodies, the location of the fire, and the surrounding trees. He drew the hatchet, the broken rifle, and the scattered playing cards that lay rotting in the grass. A poignant reminder of the boredom the men must have endured before the violence erupted. His pencil scratched across the paper, capturing the horror in grayscale. The meadow of remains was a silent indictment of Alfred Packer's story. There was no sign of the self-defense struggle Packer had described. The men appeared to have been executed, their heads smashed in and then systematically harvested for food. After completing his grim task, Randolph packed his supplies and hurried down the mountain. He rode hard for the agency, carrying the news that would electrify the territory. When he arrived, he presented his sketches and his testimony to the officials. The drawings were gruesome and undeniable. They showed a camp where men had been murdered, not a place where men had died of starvation. The specific detail of the hatchet wounds contradicted Packer's claim that Bell had killed the others. If Bell had killed them, why was he also butchered? And if Packer killed Bell in self-defense, why were the other 4 skulls crushed in the exact same manner as Bell's? The forensic consistency pointed to a single killer, the man who had the hatchet. A recovery team was immediately dispatched to the site to retrieve the remains and gather formal evidence. This time there was no need for a guide. Randolph's directions were precise. The coroner from Saguache, accompanied by General Adams and Preston Nutter, led the team. When they arrived at the site, the reality was even worse than Randolph's sketches could convey. The smell was overpowering. The men tied handkerchiefs soaked in camphor around their faces as they worked. They examined the bones closely. The coroner, Dr. W.W.H. Age, noted that the flesh had been removed from the bones while the bodies were still warm or shortly after death, indicated by the retraction of the tissues. He pointed out the cut marks on the femurs and ribs, explaining that they were made by a sharp knife slicing downward to fillet the meat. The geography of the site played a crucial role in the preservation and subsequent discovery of the remains. The location, situated in a dense grove of spruce and fir on the north-facing slope, retained the snow longer than the surrounding areas. This meant that for weeks after the murders, the bodies had been essentially refrigerated, delaying the onset of putrefaction until the true heat of July set in. By August, the thaw was complete, and the accelerated decomposition had created the olfactory beacon that drew Randolph in. The recovery of the bodies was a logistical nightmare. The terrain was steep and covered in deadfall timber. The men had to construct makeshift litters to move the remains to the burial trench. Handling the decomposing flesh was a task that tested the stomachs of even the hardest frontiersmen. They worked in shifts, taking breaks to breathe the clean air away from the hollow. They used shovels to move the scattered bones, scraping the earth to ensure they collected every fragment of the Arizona party. The wallets and personal items found in Packer's possession were now matched to the bodies. The pipe found on Packer belonged to the man whose skull was shattered. The knife on Packer's belt fit the cuts on the ribs of the man in the clearing. The physical chain of evidence was complete. The team also found other items that linked Packer to the scene. They found scraps of paper with Packer's handwriting, perhaps a journal or a note he had started and discarded. They found a small mirror that matched the description of one Packer had tried to sell in Saguache. Most damning of all, they found that the path from the fire to the bodies was worn into the earth, a track made by a man, walking back and forth repeatedly. This path of the butcher showed that the survivor had stayed at the camp for a significant amount of time after the deaths, living among the corpses, cooking his meals over the fire while his companions rotted feet away. The bodies were buried on the site in a shallow mass grave near the river. The men piled stones over the mound to keep the animals away. A rough wooden marker was placed to designate the final resting place of the 5 victims. The Cannibal Plateau, as it was beginning to be called, was now a marked location on the map of American infamy. The recovery team collected the skulls to bring back as evidence for the trial. They wrapped the grisly trophies in canvas sacks and strapped them to the pack mules. The journey down the mountain with the rattling bones was a somber procession. When the team returned to Saguache with the physical proof of the murders, the mood in the town shifted from suspicion to murderous rage. The sketches were shown to the public, or at least described in graphic detail. The image of Frank Miller's headless body and the crushed skulls of the others ignited a desire for lynch mob justice. The narrative was no longer one of survival. It was one of predation. Packer was not a man who had made a hard choice. He was a monster who had smashed the heads of sleeping men to steal their money and eat their flesh. The forensic evidence gathered in August 1874 dismantled every lie Packer had told. He had claimed Swan died of hunger. Swan's skull was crushed. He had claimed the others died naturally. They were all bludgeoned. He had claimed self-defense against Bell. Bell was shot and bludgeoned and butchered. The timeline also collapsed. The state of the camp suggested a prolonged habitation, not a hasty exit. The sheer amount of flesh missing from the bodies calculated against the time Packer claimed to have spent there. He had eaten enough to gain weight, to thrive, while surrounded by the dead. General Adams, upon seeing the evidence, issued a warrant for Packer's arrest on 5 counts of murder. The legal machinery of the territory began to turn, but it was slow and clumsy in the remote frontier. Packer, sitting in his confinement, likely sensed the change in the atmosphere. The guards were less talkative, their eyes harder. The townspeople outside spoke in hushed, angry tones. The discovery of the meadow of remains had stripped away his mask. He was naked before the law, and the law was bringing a rope. The summer of 1874 had revealed the secrets of the winter. The grass grew tall through the ribs of the dead, and the sun bleached the blood from the soil, but the stain on history was permanent. The 5 men, Swan, Miller, Bell, Noon, and Humphrey, had been found. Their silence was broken by the testimony of their broken bones. The story of the Arizona party had reached its grim crescendo in that high mountain clearing. Now, the focus shifted to the man who had put them there. But Alfred Packer, sensing the tightening noose, had no intention of staying to hear the verdict. The ghost of the meadow would haunt him, but he would try to outrun it one last time. August 1874 found Alfred Packer confined within a crude structure in Saguache that barely qualified as a jail. The makeshift prison was a log cabin with a dirt floor, reinforced only by the casual vigilance of the local sheriff and the assumption that a man in leg irons could not travel far. However, the anger of the townspeople following the discovery of the bodies at Slumgullion Pass was reaching a boiling point, creating an atmosphere of impending lynch law that permeated the heavy summer air. Packer, sitting in the dim light of the cabin, could hear the murmurs of the men outside, voices thick with liquor and the promise of violence. He knew that the legal process in the Colorado Territory was often preempted by a rope thrown over a cottonwood branch. His survival instinct, the same primal force that had driven him to consume his companions, was now entirely focused on escaping the consequences of that meal. The irons on his ankles were heavy, chafing the skin, raw, but the metal was of poor quality, forged by a blacksmith who likely never anticipated holding a mass murderer. The exact mechanics of his escape on the night of August 9th remain a subject of debate, but the physical reality was simple and quiet. Whether aided by a sympathetic guard who had been bribed with the last of the stolen money or simply the beneficiary of a rusted lock and a piece of wire, Packer managed to free himself from the shackles. He waited until the moon was obscured by the monsoon clouds that rolled off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, plunging the valley into a deep, impenetrable darkness. He slipped through the door, which had been left unlatched or was pried open with a piece of scrap metal. The silence of the escape was the antithesis of the noise his trial would later generate. He moved like a phantom through the sleeping town, avoiding the main street where the kerosene lamps of the saloons cast long pools of light. He stuck to the shadows of the alleyways, stepping carefully to avoid snapping a twig or disturbing a sleeping dog. Packer fled north, moving away from the San Juans and the grim evidence they held. He did not run with the panic of a novice. He moved with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man accustomed to long distances. He lacked a horse, so he walked, retracing the path toward the lower valleys where the terrain was forgiving. He stole a horse from a pasture near the edge of town, a roan mare that he rode until it was blown, then abandoned it to continue on foot to confuse any pursuers. His destination was not a specific town, but rather anonymity. He knew he had to leave the Colorado Territory entirely, as his face and name were becoming known in every mining camp from Silverton to Denver. He headed for the vast, empty plains of the Wyoming Territory, a landscape of sagebrush and wind where a man could disappear simply by standing still. For the next 9 years, Alfred Packer effectively ceased to exist. In his place stood a man named John Schwartze. The alias was generic enough to be forgettable, yet distinct enough to serve as a new identity. He drifted into the orbit of the military outposts and cattle towns that dotted the high plains. He settled initially in the vicinity of Fort Fetterman, a bleak outpost on the North Platte River. Here, the news of the Colorado Cannibal was nothing more than a distant rumor, a campfire story told to scare greenhorns. No one looked at the quiet, hard-working man mending harnesses or loading wagons and saw a monster. They saw only another laborer in a land that consumed men and spat them out. The physical transformation of Packer assisted his deception. He grew his hair longer, altered the style of his beard, and adopted a stooped posture that disguised his height. John Schwartze found employment as a teamster and a scout, ironically returning to the very professions he had failed at so spectacularly in the past. However, the high stakes of the winter mountains were replaced by the mundane drudgery of the supply train. He worked for the government, hauling freight between Cheyenne and the outlying forts. The work was brutal and repetitive. It involved lifting heavy crates of ammunition, sacks of flour, and barrels of salted pork. The physical labor kept his body strong and, perhaps more importantly, kept his mind occupied. The rhythm of the road, the creak of the wagon wheels, the snap of the reins, the dust coating his throat became his new reality. He lived in bunkhouses with other men, eating the same beans and bacon, sharing the same coarse jokes. He was careful, however, never to get too close. He maintained a barrier of reserve, a wall of silence that prevented anyone from asking questions about his past in Pennsylvania or Colorado. The seizures that had plagued him since his youth did not vanish, but they became less frequent, or perhaps he became better at hiding them. When the falling sickness struck, he would claim it was a touch of sunstroke or the result of bad whiskey. The men he worked with were not doctors. They accepted his excuses with a shrug and moved on. In the rough fraternity of the frontier, physical ailments were common, and as long as a man could pull his weight when he was on his feet, his moments of weakness were tolerated. Schwartz became known as a reliable, if somewhat eccentric worker. He paid his debts, did not cheat at cards, and kept his head down during the barroom brawls that frequently erupted in the lawless towns of Wyoming. As the years rolled by, 1876, 1878, 1880, the memory of Alfred Packer began to fade from the public consciousness in Colorado. The bones at Slumgullion Pass were buried, the marker was weathering, and the newspapers had moved on to new scandals and new strikes. Packer, living as Schwartz, began to feel a sense of security. He believed he had outrun the ghost of the meadow. He started to relax his guard. He spent more time in the saloons of Cheyenne and Douglas, drinking whiskey and listening to the piano music. He even began to tell stories again, though he was careful to strip them of any details that could link him to the San Juans. He spoke of Indian fights and buffalo hunts, weaving a tapestry of lies to cover the black hole of the winter of 1874. In the early 1880s, John Schwartz was living near Fort Fetterman, working for a man named Clay. He lived in a small dugout, a semi-subterranean dwelling carved into the side of a hill, insulated against the Wyoming wind. It was a solitary existence, but one that offered him a semblance of peace. He had money in his pocket, a roof over his head, and a name that was clean. He had successfully laundered his life. However, the past has a way of circling back in the small world of the American West. The network of wagon trails and rail lines connected the territories in a web of commerce and movement. Men moved from camp to camp, carrying their memories with them. In March 1883, the fragile safety of John Schwartz was shattered by a chance encounter that defied all statistical probability. One of the members of the original Arizona Party, a Frenchman named John Cabazon, known to everyone as Frenchy, had also drifted north. Frenchy had been part of the group that stayed at Chief Ouré's camp, the faction that had heeded the warning and taken the Gunnison route. He had known Packer. He had argued with him, eaten with him, and looked into his eyes during those tense days in the Ute village. Frenchy was now working as a freighter as well, moving goods through the same corridors that Schwartz frequented. The meeting took place at a roadhouse near the pest house of Fort Fetterman, a location where wagon trains often stopped to water their teams and resupply. It was early March, and the wind was blowing hard from the north, kicking up dust that obscured vision. Frenchy, Cabazon walked into the main room of the supply store, shaking the dust from his coat. He looked across the room and saw a man arguing with a clerk over the price of tobacco. The voice was the first thing that struck him. It was a high-pitched, whining tone that grated on the ear. Frenchy froze. He knew that voice. He had heard it making empty promises in the Utah desert and shouting lies in the Uncompahgre Valley. Frenchy moved closer, his eyes narrowing. The man at the counter turned, and for a split second the two men locked eyes. The beard was different, graying now, and the face was lined with the passage of 9 years, but the eyes were the same. They were the blue, flat eyes of Alfred Packer. The man who called himself Schwartz did not panic immediately. He looked at Frenchie with a flicker of recognition that he quickly suppressed. He turned back to the clerk, paid for his tobacco, and walked out of the store with a hurried step. Frenchie did not confront him there. He was unarmed, and he knew Packer was a dangerous man. Instead, Frenchie went straight to the authorities. He found Sheriff Malcolm Campbell, a legendary lawman of the Wyoming Territory, and told him the story. He explained that the notorious Colorado Cannibal, the man who had a price on his head, was living just miles away under the name John Schwartze. Campbell was skeptical at first. The Packer case was old news, a cold trail. But Frenchie was insistent. He described Packer's mannerisms, his laugh, and the missing top of his little finger on the left hand, a detail that only someone who knew him well would remember. Campbell agreed to investigate. He gathered a small posse, not wanting to spook the suspect, and rode out to the location Frenchie had indicated. On March 11, 1883, Sheriff Campbell and his deputy arrived at the wagon camp where Schwartze was staying. They found him sitting by a fire, cooking his breakfast. The scene was eerily reminiscent of the camp where he had been found 9 years earlier. But this time there were no bodies, only the mundane tools of a teamster. Campbell approached him casually, asking for his name. "John Schwartze," the man replied, his voice steady. Campbell dismounted and walked closer. He asked Schwartze if he had ever been to Colorado. Schwartze denied it, claiming he had come from the Montana Territory. Campbell then played his ace. He brought Frenchie Cabazon forward from where he had been waiting behind the horses. The moment Packer saw Frenchie, the facade collapsed. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and waxy. He did not run. There was nowhere to go. The open plains offered no cover, and Campbell's hand was resting on the butt of his revolver. Frenchie pointed a finger at him and said simply, "Hello, Al." The use of his real name was a hammer blow that shattered the identity of John Schwartze. Packer stammered, trying to maintain the lie, but his voice betrayed him. The tremors returned, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the tin cup he was holding. Campbell placed him under arrest, handcuffing him and hoisting him onto a horse. The journey from the wagon camp to the jail in Cheyenne was a long, silent ride. Packer sat slumped in the saddle, a man defeated by his own survival. The 9 years of freedom, hard won and carefully guarded, had evaporated in an instant. He was no longer the respected teamster. He was once again the butcher. During the transport, Packer remained sullen, refusing to answer questions. He knew that once he crossed the border back into Colorado, his life hung by a thread. The legal system had been waiting for him, the warrant still active, the ink dry, but the mandate clear. Once in custody in Cheyenne, the news of his capture spread via telegraph wire with the speed of lightning. "The man-eater caught" was the headline that flashed across the nation. General Adams, who was now living in Denver, was notified immediately. He made arrangements to travel to Wyoming to identify the prisoner personally. The reunion between the general and the cannibal took place in the Cheyenne jail. Adams walked into the cell block and stopped in front of the bars. He looked at the aging, broken man sitting on the cot. "Do you know me, Al?" Adams asked. Packer looked up, his eyes filled with resignation. "Yes, General," he replied. "I know you." With his identity confirmed, the extradition process began. Packer was to be transported back to Colorado to stand trial for the murder of the 5 men. But before he left Wyoming, he made a second confession. This statement, given to a reporter from a Cheyenne newspaper, differed significantly from the one he had given to Adams 9 years earlier. In this version, the details of the deaths shifted again. He claimed that the party had been starving, and that the others had died of natural causes one by one, and that he had only eaten them after they were already dead to save himself. He vehemently denied killing anyone, even Bell, in this version. trying to paint himself as a victim of circumstance who had merely violated the taboo of the flesh, not the law against murder about the taking of life. He claimed that Old Man Swan died first from hunger, and after days of starvation the others began to eat him. Then, according to this new story, the butcher Miller died, then Humphrey, then Noon. He stated that Bell was the last to die, freezing to death in the night. This narrative was a calculated attempt to mitigate the charges. If they all died naturally, he was guilty only of cannibalism, which was not technically a capital crime in the statutes of the time. He was trying to thread the needle of the law, hoping that the lack of witnesses would save him from the gallows. However, he did not know that the forensic evidence collected by the coroner 9 years prior, the crushed skulls, the defensive positions, would directly contradict this sanitary version of events. The train ride back to Denver was a spectacle. Crowds gathered at every station to catch a glimpse of the monster. Packer sat by the window, staring out at the passing landscape. He saw the mountains rising in the distance, the white peaks shining in the spring sun. They were no longer a refuge. They were a witness stand. He arrived in Denver to a mob scene. The people of Colorado had not forgotten. The anger that had simmered for nearly a decade boiled over. There were shouts of "hang him" and "murderer" as he was escorted from the train to the waiting wagon. The police had to form a phalanx to protect him from the very people he had once tried to deceive. He was transported to the jail in Lake City, the town that had sprung up near the site of the massacre. The irony was absolute. He was being held miles from the meadow where he had butchered his friends. The cell in Lake City was sturdy, built of stone and iron, designed to hold men exactly like him. There would be no escape this time. No loose irons, no sleeping guards. The ghost of John Schwartz was dead, left behind in the dust of Wyoming. Alfred Packer was back, and the ghosts of Swan, Miller, Bell, Noon, and Humphrey were waiting for him in the courtroom. The discovery of Packer after 9 years remains one of the most remarkable instances of delayed justice in the history of the West. He had successfully integrated himself into society, proving that he could live among men without harming them. He had worked, paid taxes, and lived a quiet life. This fact would later complicate the public's perception of him. Was he a madman with an incurable bloodlust? Or was he a desperate man who had done a terrible thing once and then tried to live a moral life? The duality of his existence, the cannibal in the mountains and the teamster on the plains, created a psychological puzzle that the courts would struggle to solve. As March turned to April in 1883, the preparations for the trial began. The prosecution dusted off the old sketches by Randolph and the coroner's reports. They located the witnesses, including Preston Nutter, who was eager to testify. Packer's defense team, appointed by the court, faced an impossible task. They had a client who had fled the jurisdiction, lived under an alias, and given conflicting confessions. The physical evidence of the hatchet wounds was the silent, immutable fact that no story could talk away. The ghost of John Schwartz had been exorcised, leaving only the flesh and blood man to answer for the crimes of the butcher. March 1883 brought Alfred Packer back to the very geography he had fled 9 years earlier. But the landscape had changed as drastically as his own fortunes. Lake City, Colorado, the town where the trial was to be convened, was barely taking shape when the crimes were committed. It had sprung up from the wilderness, a boomtown built on the same mining fever that had lured the Arizona Party to their doom. The settlement sat in the shadow of the mountains that held the secrets of the dead, creating an oppressive atmosphere where the scenery itself served as a witness for the prosecution. Packer was confined in the Hinsdale County Jail, a sturdy structure of stone and wood that offered none of the lax security of his previous incarceration in Saguache. The town was alive with a venomous energy, the residents viewing the prisoner not merely as a criminal, but as a local demon whose presence stained the reputation of their burgeoning community. The streets were filled with miners, merchants, and curious onlookers who had traveled from as far as Denver to witness the reckoning of the man-eater. The legal proceedings began in early April 1883 in the Hinsdale County Courthouse, a building that smelled of fresh-cut pine and stale tobacco smoke. The presiding judge was Melville B. Jerry, a man of stern countenance and rigid adherence to the law, who sat behind the bench with the gravity of an executioner. The prosecution was led by the district attorney, who was determined to secure a conviction that would echo throughout the West. The defense counsel, appointed by the court to represent the penniless Packer, faced a monumental task. They were defending a man who had fled the jurisdiction, lived under an alias, and provided conflicting confessions. Their strategy relied heavily on the claim of self-defense, asserting that Shannon Bell had snapped and killed the others, forcing Packer to kill Bell to survive. It was a narrative of tragic necessity, a plea for mercy based on the extreme duress of starvation. The courtroom was packed to capacity every day, the air thick with the heat of crowded bodies and the murmur of whispered conversations. The jury selection was a laborious process, as finding 12 men in the region who had not already formed a fixed opinion on Packer's guilt was nearly impossible. Eventually, a panel was seated, a collection of hard-faced men who looked at the defendant with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Packer sat at the defense table, his posture slumped, his eyes scanning the floor. He looked older than his 41 years, the stress of the fugitive life and the recent capture having carved deep lines into his face. He wore a suit that hung loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to the rough woolens he had worn in the mountains. The prosecution opened its case by systematically dismantling the self-defense theory using the physical evidence that had been waiting in the earth for 9 years. They called John Randolph, the illustrator who had discovered the meadow of remains. Randolph took the stand and described in clinical detail the position of the bodies as he had found them in August 1874. He testified that the men were not scattered as if in a chaotic fight, but lay in a rough semicircle around the fire wrapped in their blankets. This testimony painted a picture of men who were attacked while they slept or relaxed, not men who were engaged in a life-or-death struggle. He described the tranquil setting of the grove, a detail that made the violence seem even more heinous. Then came the medical testimony, the gridiron upon which Packer's story would be roasted. The prosecution brought forth the skulls of the 5 victims, which had been preserved as evidence. When the coroner placed the bleached bones on the table in front of the jury, a hush fell over the room. The reality of the crime was no longer a story, it was a physical object. The coroner pointed to the defects in the bone. He showed the jury the rectangular depression in the skull of Israel Swan, a perfect match for the pole of a hatchet. He demonstrated the multiple fractures on the skull of Frank Miller and the crushing blows delivered to George Noon and James Humphrey. The most damaging evidence concerned the skull of Shannon Bell. Packer's entire defense rested on the claim that Bell was the aggressor, a madman who had killed the others. However, the coroner testified that Bell's skull also bore the signature hatchet wound, delivered from above. Furthermore, the angle of the gunshot wound in Bell's hip suggested he was shot from a distance, or while on the ground, not while charging with a rifle stock as Packer claimed. The forensic narrative was clear. One man had wielded the hatchet against 5 others who were likely incapacitated or asleep. The sheer consistency of the wounds argued against a frantic melee and pointed toward a methodical execution. Preston Nutter took the stand, his voice ringing with the vindication of a man who had suspected the truth for nearly a decade. He recounted the days in the Ute camp, the warnings from Chief Urey and Packer's reckless behavior. He testified regarding the money and personal effects found in Packer's possession in Saguache. He identified the skinning knife Packer had carried as belonging to Frank Miller and the pipe as belonging to another victim. Nutter's testimony established the motive: robbery. The prosecution argued that Packer had not eaten the men solely to survive. He had killed them to take their accumulated wealth, however meager, and the cannibalism was merely a convenient way to dispose of the evidence and sustain himself during the winter. When Alfred Packer took the stand in his own defense, the tension in the room was palpable. He spoke in a low, whining voice, repeating the story of Bell's madness. He claimed that he had returned to the camp after a scouting trip to find Bell roasting a piece of meat he had cut from the leg of the German butcher Miller. He described Bell rushing at him with a hatchet, his eyes wild with hunger-induced insanity. Packer claimed he shot Bell in the midsection and then finished him with the hatchet in a desperate struggle. He admitted to eating the flesh of the men, but only after they were dead. He denied killing Swan, Miller, Humphrey, or Noon. He wept as he spoke, wiping his eyes with a dirty handkerchief, begging the jury to understand the horror of the situation. However, on cross-examination, the district attorney tore into his story. He asked why, if it was self-defense, Packer had hidden the truth for 9 years. He asked why he had stolen their wallets. He asked why he had told General Adams one story in 1874, and the Wyoming Reporter a different story in 1883. Packer fumbled for answers, his lies tangling in a web of contradictions. He could not explain the hatchet wounds on the other 4 men if Bell had killed them, as Bell would have presumably used the rifle or a knife. The logic of his defense crumbled under the weight of the forensic facts. The jury watched him, their faces unreadable, but the air in the room grew colder with every stammered response. On April 13, 1883, the jury retired to deliberate. They did not take long. The evidence was overwhelming, and the character of the defendant was thoroughly unimpeached. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of premeditated murder for the death of Israel Swan. The prosecution had chosen to focus on Swan because he was the oldest and the most defenseless, making the crime appear particularly cowardly. The foreman read the verdict to a silent courtroom. Packer stood, his hands gripping the railing, his face pale. Judge Jerry scheduled the sentencing for a few days later. When the time came, the judge delivered a speech that was solemn and blistering, devoid of the colorful humor that legend would later attribute to it. He did not rant about Democrats. He spoke of the violation of the laws of God and man. He looked down at Packer and stated that he had been convicted of a crime of revolting atrocity. He sentenced Alfred Packer to be hanged by the neck until dead, setting the date for May 19, 1883. The sentence was a death knell, echoing the finality of the judgment. Packer was led away in chains, destined for the gallows. However, the legal saga of the Colorado Cannibal was far from over. Packer's defense team, desperate to save their client, began to scour the law books for an appeal. They found a glaring error in the legislative history of Colorado that would turn the case on its head. The crime had been committed in 1874 when Colorado was still a territory. Packer was tried in 1883 after Colorado had become a state. In the transition from territorial law to state law, the legislature had repealed the territorial criminal code without including a saving clause for crimes committed prior to statehood. This created a legal vacuum. Technically, the law under which Packer was convicted did not exist at the time of his trial, and the law that existed at the time of the crime had been repealed. It was a technicality of the highest order, an ex post facto nightmare for the state. The defense attorneys filed a writ of error with the Colorado Supreme Court. The execution was stayed while the High Court reviewed the case. For 3 years, Packer sat in jail, his life hanging in the balance of a clerical oversight. The public was outraged. The idea that a mass murderer could walk free because of a legislative mistake was repugnant to the citizens of the frontier. Editorials in newspapers across the state demanded justice, regardless of the legal loopholes. In October 1885, the Colorado Supreme Court issued its ruling. They reversed the conviction of murder. The court agreed with the defense that Packer could not be executed for a crime committed under a statute that had been repealed. The murder conviction was void. However, the court did not set him free. They ruled that while the murder statute was unenforceable, the state could still pursue charges under the remaining statutes that had not been affected by the transition in the same way, or they ordered a retrial under a specific interpretation of the manslaughter provisions. The legal wrangling was complex, but the result was clear. Packer would face a second trial, but the death penalty was off the table. The venue for the second trial was moved to Gunnison, Colorado, a town west of the Continental Divide, to ensure a fairer trial and to avoid the overheated atmosphere of Lake City. In 1886, Packer was transported to Gunnison. The town was bustling, and the trial once again attracted a massive crowd. This time, the prosecution charged him with 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter. The strategy was to secure the maximum penalty for each count, ensuring that even without the hangman's noose, Packer would never breathe free air again. The second trial in Gunnison mirrored the first in many ways. The same grisly evidence was presented. The skulls were once again placed before a jury. The same witnesses testified to the deception and the flight. However, the defense had a new angle. Since the charge was manslaughter, they argued that the killing was done in the heat of passion or under extreme provocation, fitting the definition of the charge. They reiterated the starvation defense, hoping for sympathy. But the residents of Gunnison were no more sympathetic than those of Lake City. They saw a man who had violated the most basic tenet of survival. The pack looks out for the pack. Packer seemed more resigned during this second proceeding. The fight had gone out of him. He sat passively, listening to the lawyers argue over the definition of his monstrous acts. He knew that he had escaped the rope, which was a victory in itself. The fear of death that had driven him to escape Saguache was replaced by the grim acceptance of imprisonment. He looked at the jury not with pleading, but with a dull stare. The courtroom in Gunnison was a theater of formality, stripping away the sensationalism to focus on the cold math of sentencing. On August 5, 1886, the jury in Gunnison returned their verdict. They found Alfred Packer guilty on all 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter. The verdict was a compromise between the demand for blood and the constraints of the law. It acknowledged the killings but legally categorized them as something less than premeditated murder due to the statutory mess. However, the judge in Gunnison had no intention of being lenient. He decided to stack the sentences consecutively. The judge called Packer to stand for the final time. He sentenced him to 8 years of hard labor for each of the 5 victims: Israel Swan, Frank Miller, George Noon, James Humphrey, and Shannon Bell. The total sentence was 40 years. At the time, it was the longest custodial sentence ever handed down in the United States. The judge stated that while he could not hang Packer, he could ensure that he died within the stone walls of the penitentiary. 40 years was effectively a life sentence for a man of 44 who had lived a hard, unhealthy existence. The reaction to the sentence was mixed. Many felt that 40 years was insufficient for the crime of butchering 5 men. They wanted the rope. Others felt that the law had finally caught up with the slippery drifter. Packer accepted the sentence without emotion. He was shackled immediately, the heavy irons placed on his wrists and ankles. He was led out of the Gunnison courthouse through the crowd that parted to let the convict pass. There were no cheers, only a heavy silence. The show was over. The legend had been processed by the state and reduced to a prisoner number. The transport to the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City was arranged immediately. Packer was placed on a train, guarded by armed deputies. As the locomotive chugged eastward, crossing the high passes and descending into the Arkansas Valley, Packer watched the mountains recede. He was leaving the high country for the last time. The San Juans, with their deep snows and dark forests, were now behind him. Ahead lay the gray stone walls of the prison, a different kind of wilderness where time would be the enemy. The gavel and the gridiron had done their work. The forensic science of the day, primitive but effective, had grilled Packer's lies until they disintegrated. The legal system, despite its clumsy transition from territory to state, had managed to ensnare him. He was no longer the man-eater roaming the plains. He was convict number 1389. The doors of the penitentiary would close behind him, shutting out the world he had tried to manipulate. But even in prison, the story would not die. It would fester and grow, fed by the curiosity of a public that could not look away from the man who had survived the white hell by consuming his own kind. The 40-year sentence marked the end of his freedom, but it was the beginning of his transformation into a folk figure. In the confinement of Cannon City, Packer would become a model prisoner, a gardener, and a weaver of horsehair bridles. He would maintain his innocence to anyone who would listen, refining his story, smoothing out the edges, trying to talk his way out of history's judgment. But the gavel had fallen, and the record was set. The skulls with the hatchet marks remained in the possession of the state, silent, grinning proof that the heat of passion was a cold, calculated hunger. As the train pulled into the station at Cannon City, the steam hissing from the brakes, Alfred Packer stood up. The chains rattled. He stepped off the platform and walked toward the prison wagon. The sky was blue and vast, the same sky that had covered the meadow of remains. He looked up at it for a moment, perhaps remembering the taste of the wind on Slumgullion Pass before ducking his head and entering the cage. The winter was over, the trial was done, and the long, slow years of retribution were finally beginning. August 1886 marked the beginning of a new epoch in the life of Alfred Packer, one defined not by the open expanse of the mountains but by the rigid geometry of the Colorado State Penitentiary. The massive stone walls of the prison in Cannon City rose from the dry earth of the Arkansas Valley, a fortress designed to crush the spirit through silence and repetition. Packer was stripped of his civilian clothes, the last remnants of his life as a drifter, and issued the striped uniform of a convict. He was assigned inmate number 1389. The intake process was cold and bureaucratic. His head was shaved, removing the long matted hair that had become his trademark during the trials. He was measured, weighed, and catalogued, his physical description recorded in the ledger with the same detachment used for livestock. The prison doctor noted the scars on his body and the missing top of his little finger, permanent identifiers that linked him to his past. For the first few years of his 40-year sentence, Packer labored in the prison quarry. The work was grueling, involving the breaking of limestone rock under the relentless glare of the sun. The dust from the stone coated his lungs and skin, turning him into a gray ghost. He swung a sledgehammer with a mechanical rhythm, his body hardening to the task. Unlike the younger, more volatile inmates who fought against the confinement, Packer adapted with the peculiar resilience he had shown in the wilderness. He kept his head down, spoke little, and obeyed every order given by the guards. He understood the hierarchy of the prison just as he had understood the hierarchy of the survival camp. There were those who held the power, and there were those who submitted to survive. His epilepsy, the falling sickness that had plagued his youth, seemed to go into remission during these years of intense physical labor, perhaps suppressed by the exhaustion that claimed him every night. As the 1890s arrived, the prison administration took note of Packer's docile behavior. He was not the monster the newspapers had described. He was a quiet, aging man who caused no trouble. He was transferred from the hard labor of the quarry to more trusted positions within the prison walls. He worked in the gardens, tending to the vegetables that fed the inmate population. The contact with the soil and the plants seemed to soothe him. He spent hours weeding and watering, his hands moving with a gentleness that belied the violence of his crime. Later, he was assigned to the prison storeroom where he learned the craft of leatherworking and weaving. This new skill gave him a purpose beyond mere existence. He began to fashion bridles, lariats, and canes using horsehair and wood. The bridles became his signature creation. He would twist the coarse horsehair into intricate patterns, braiding the strands with a patience that only a man with infinite time could possess. He sold these items to the curious tourists who visited the prison gift shop. The celebrity of the Colorado Cannibal had not diminished. If anything, it had mutated into a macabre fascination. People paid good money to own an object made by the hands that had butchered 5 men. Packer would sometimes be allowed to speak to these visitors, standing behind a barrier selling his wares. He presented himself as a victim, a misunderstood old scout who had been persecuted by a vindictive legal system. He told them he had been forced to eat the flesh to survive, omitting the brutal details of the hatchet wounds. His soft voice and weary eyes convinced many that he was a martyr rather than a murderer. Inside the walls, the decade turned. 1893 brought economic panic to the outside world, but inside the penitentiary, the routine remained absolute. Packer aged. His hair grew back white and his beard returned, giving him the appearance of a biblical patriarch. He became a fixture of the institution, a trustee who was allowed certain privileges. He had his own small space where he could work on his crafts. He read the Bible, or at least claimed to, and attended the Sunday services. The other prisoners left him alone, partially out of fear of his reputation, and partially because he offered them nothing. He was a man apart, living in a mental space that was neither fully in the prison nor fully in the world. He spoke often of the justice that would one day free him, maintaining his innocence with a stubborn consistency. In the late 1890s, the political winds in Colorado began to shift, bringing a new character into Packer's orbit who would change his fate. Polly Pry, a flamboyant and aggressive reporter for the Denver Post, took an interest in his case. Her real name was Leonel Ross O'Brien, and she was a pioneer of sob sister journalism, a style that prioritized emotional narrative and sensationalism. She visited Packer in Cannon City and saw in him the perfect subject for a crusade. She painted him not as a villain, but as a pitiful old man, a veteran of the Civil War who had been scapegoated to cover up the failures of the territory. The Denver Post, owned by the showmen Frederick Bonfils and Harry Tamman, threw its weight behind the campaign. They published articles detailing his poor health, his exemplary prison record, and the questionable legality of his conviction. The campaign for Packer's release became a heated political issue. The Post argued that he had served enough time for manslaughter and that keeping him imprisoned was cruel. They attacked the validity of the forensic evidence, suggesting it had been manufactured or misinterpreted by the prosecution. Polly Pry wrote tear-jerking columns about Packer's longing for the mountains and his desire to die a free man. She brought him gifts, listened to his stories, and polished his rough edges for the reading public. Packer played his part perfectly. He wept on. Q expressed remorse for the consumption of the bodies while steadfastly denying the murders and presented himself as a broken vessel of humanity. The pressure mounted on the governor's office. In January 1901, the outgoing governor, Charles S. Thomas, made his final decision. He was skeptical of Packer's innocence but acknowledged the legal complexities of the case and the length of time served. He also recognized that Packer was an old man with failing health who posed no threat to society. In 1901, Governor Thomas signed the parole papers. The news flashed across the state. The man-eater was free. Packer was released on the condition that he remain within the state and report his movements, but he was no longer a prisoner of the stone walls. Packer walked out of the Cannon City Penitentiary on January 8, 1901. He was 58 years old, but he looked 20 years older. He wore a suit provided by the Denver Post and carried a small bag containing his personal effects and the money he had earned from his bridles. He squinted in the winter sunlight, the vastness of the horizon disorienting him after 15 years of confinement. Polly Pry was there to meet him, ushering him into a carriage. They traveled to Denver, where he was briefly paraded through the offices of the Denver Post, a living trophy of their journalistic power. However, the bustle of the city and the noise of the crowds terrified him. He was a man of the wilderness and the cell. The urban environment was a chaos he could not navigate. He eventually settled in the quiet town of Littleton, located south of Denver. He found lodging with the Van Gundy family, renting a small room in their house on the outskirts of town. The arrangement was simple. He would pay his rent, help with minor chores, and keep to himself. The Van Gundys were decent people who looked past the legend and saw the frail man. Packer's life in Littleton was a strange twilight existence. He became a local curiosity, a ghost haunting the edges of the community. He spent his days sitting on the porch of the general store or walking along the irrigation ditches watching the water flow. The children of Littleton were fascinated by him. They would dare each other to approach the cannibal, expecting a monster. Instead, they found a grandfatherly figure who would give them candy and tell them stories about the bears and the wolves. He never spoke to the children about the winter of 1874. To them, he was just Uncle Al, a man with a white beard and shaking hands. The parents were less trusting. They warned their children to stay away, whispering the grim details of the hatchet and the pot. But Packer did no harm. The violence that had erupted in the San Juans seemed to have burned itself out, leaving only ash. Packer worked briefly as a guard at the Denver Post building during a strike, but his physical condition could not sustain the employment. He retreated back to Littleton, living off his military pension, which he had finally managed to secure based on his Civil War service and the generosity of the Van Gundys. He spent his money on whiskey, which remained his constant companion. The alcohol dulled the sharp edges of his memories and soothed the tremors that had returned with age. He could often be found in the local saloons, drinking alone at a corner table. When patrons recognized him and bought him a drink, he would tell his story. The version where he was the victim, the version where Bell was the madman. He told it so many times that he likely came to believe it completely. His health began to decline rapidly in 1906. The years of hard living, the starvation in the mountains, the prison labor, and the heavy drinking had destroyed his internal organs. He suffered from Bright's disease, a condition of the kidneys, and his liver was failing. The falling sickness seizures became more frequent and more violent, leaving him bedridden for days. He grew weak, his voice reducing to a whisper. The Van Gundy family cared for him, bringing him soup and changing his linens. They saw the man suffering, not the criminal. In the spring of 1907, it became clear that the end was near. Packer lay in his bed in the small room in Littleton, surrounded by the few possessions he had accumulated. He had a few of his horsehair bridles, a Bible, and some letters from Polly Pry. The reporter visited him one last time, documenting the fading of the legend. Packer grabbed her hand, his grip weak, and reiterated his innocence. "I didn't kill them, Polly," he rasped. "It was Bell. It was the hunger." He clung to this truth until the very end, refusing to confess to the murders even as he faced the final judgment. On April 23, 1907, Alfred Packer died. He was 65 years old. The cause of death was listed as senility, trouble and worry on some reports, but medically it was a combination of heart and kidney failure. He passed away quietly, without the violence that had defined his life. There was no hatchet, no snow, no gnawing hunger. Just a final rattling breath in a dim room, and then silence. The news of his death spread quickly. The Denver Post ran the headline announcing the passing of the most infamous man in Colorado history. The funeral was held in Littleton. It was a modest affair, attended by the Van Gundy family, Polly Pry, and a few curious onlookers. There were no weeping masses, no state officials. He was buried in the Prince Avenue Cemetery in Littleton. Because he was a veteran of the Civil War, despite his dishonorable discharge and short service, he was granted a military headstone. The stone was simple, white marble, inscribed with his name, his regiment, and the words, Company C, 8th Iowa Cavalry. It made no mention of the San Juans, the cannibalism, or the prison sentence. It identified him only as a soldier. However, the legend of the man-eater could not be buried so easily. In the days following the interment, rumors began to circulate that grave robbers intended to dig up the body. Some wanted his skull for a museum. Others wanted to see if the man who ate human flesh looked different in death. To prevent this desecration, or perhaps to ensure that he stayed in the ground, a thick layer of concrete was poured over the grave. The slab hardened, sealing Alfred Packer into the earth permanently. It was a final heavy punctuation mark to a life of wandering. The grave in Littleton became a macabre tourist attraction almost immediately. People came to stand on the concrete and wonder about the man beneath it. They told the stories of the 5 men, Swan, Miller, Bell, Noon, and Humphrey, whose bones lay hundreds of miles away in the high mountains. They debated his guilt. Was he a cold-blooded killer who murdered for money? Was he a victim of circumstance who did what he had to do to survive? Or was he a madman driven by a biological imperative that civilized people could not understand? Alfred Packer's legacy in the West was cemented not by his life, but by the questions he left behind. He became a figure of folklore. A boogeyman used to scare children into behaving. Be good or Al Packer will get you, mothers would say. But he also became a symbol of the savage, unforgiving nature of the frontier. He represented the thin line between civilization and barbarism, the terrifying truth that when the veneer of society is stripped away by cold and hunger, man is just another animal in the food chain. The story of the Arizona Party, which began with 21 hopeful men in Utah, ended with one old man under a slab of concrete in Littleton. The gold they had sought was never found. The Breckenridge mines remained a myth for them. The only thing they achieved was a grim immortality. The names of the victims would be remembered only because of the manner of their deaths. Alfred Packer, the epileptic drifter, the failed soldier, the fraudulent guide, had eaten his way into history. As the years passed, the concrete over his grave settled, cracking slightly under the Colorado sun. The grass grew around the edges and the seasons turned. The snow fell on Littleton just as it fell on Slumgullion Pass, covering the world in white. But the story remained, whispered in the wind, a cautionary tale of greed, survival, and the dark hunger that lies in the heart of the winter mountains. 6 men entered, only 1 came back. And now, he too was gone, leaving behind only the silence of the grave and the enduring, horrific legend of the Colorado Cannibal.